wall says 12:30, so maybe that's a good reason to start. Appreciate everybody being here. We're expecting Teresa to be here, and as soon as she's on her way, and will be joining us. I think everybody has received some replacement pages for the meeting tomorrow. If you haven't, let us know. We'll get you a folder. It's not much, I guess, mostly new information, but a couple of replacement items there that need to get into your notebook. Okay, we are got a important agenda here for the workshop today. We've got a large number of important items that need to talk about. Look forward to that. We'll begin with item on the uniform grading policy, and Gary is going to introduce that. So, Gary.
Thank you. Several of you were not on the board in 2004 and 5. And when I joined the board in 2004 as executive director, the legislature had just passed a bill requiring the board to develop a uniform grading policy. And it was for the purpose of calculating a GPA to meet the requirement for the Hope Lottery Scholarship. And we did that. We set up a policy where it was not weighted on a 5-point scale. All the Hopes are calculated on a 4, but there were additional points added to the teacher's grade if it was an honors course or an AP or an IB, as a way of giving kids an advantage for taking a harder course, an incentive. In that proposal that you approved, we left open the option for an LEA to have a weighted system for purposes other than Hope Lottery scholarships. If they wanted to have a weighted system where it had a 5-point for an A in certain courses, they could do so for calculating class rank and recognizing students at graduation and other purposes. And so we're well along into that now. And this was I had a meeting with Mr. David Beam a few months ago, and he had an unpleasant experience that he wants to share with you about the weighted systems for other purposes. And I know that Knox County has a weighted system, and I know Metro has just approved that they're moving into a weighted GPA system. So I think it may be an emerging thing that we've got to be cognizant of, and I want you to hear his story so we can be alert and at least be watching and ready to respond. So, David Beam, welcome.
Gary. Thank you. Well, I'm David Beam from Knoxville, Tennessee. Went to school in Cookeville, Tennessee Tech, and migrated into Nashville. Raised 2 kids here in Brentwood, and my kids went to Scales, Brentwood Middle, Brentwood High, and lived in Williamson County for about, on and off, for about 15, 18 years. My daughter graduated 4 years ago from high school, and of course the Hope Scholarship was there. She had good enough grades. I think she had like a 3.5 and made well on the ACT score. So she is actually graduating this year from the University of Tennessee and has used the Hope Scholarship every semester. So proud of her for keeping her grades above the 3.0. That's a good incentive for parents, students. It keeps them focused, so they're not down there for the wrong reason. Now my son, Chad, is from, he's went to Brentwood Middle, Brentwood High, and we started 4 years ago, we started hearing, oh, put your kids in honor classes. It prepares them for college. AP classes, put them in these AP classes because it helps them out. And so we did. We put Chad for 4 years, he took honor classes. Well, through the years, he made A's and B's, and I was going to try to show this. This is the transcripts for the last 4 years of my son. His 2008, 2009, he had a 3.34. The next year, he had a 2.97. The next year, he had a 3.2. The senior year, 3.6. So he maintained a good little average taking honor classes and maintained a 3.0 average. Well, he graduated, and during the graduation, we were saying, gosh, he's got the Hope Scholarship, got a 3.0, above a 3.0, and he's, of course, his ACT, he wasn't really worried about it because he had his GPA up, so he didn't really focus in on this ACT test. So when we went to graduation back in May, they listed my son down to Brentwood High School, listed him down as a Hope Scholarship recipient. Great. You know, we knew this. We knew this was going to happen because there was no questioning his grades. And feel free to ask me questions on this because I appreciate the time here. So when I went to enroll my son at Middle Tennessee State University, I was looking for the Hope Scholarship. I was writing the check out, and the university told me, says, Mr. Beam, Chad doesn't qualify for the Hope Scholarship. And I was confused, so I called Williamson County Board, called Kevin Kydell, Brentwood High School, and they started sharing this information about a weighted scale, unweighted scale. And I said, wait a sec. And then how am I supposed to know what Chad's grades were compared to what the university's telling me? So they proceeded to tell me your son has a 2.8, and he graduated through Brentwood High School as an honor student with a 3.3. So everybody thought that Chad was good to go. So the university says, sorry, Dave, you can't get the Hope Scholarship. And that was the red flag that popped up. So I, of course, got in touch with Gary and David, and we sat and discussed this. And I went to Williamson County Board to get a roadblock. I was just there Monday night with a friend of mine, voiced my opinion. I had 90 seconds to get up and talk in front of him. Not one response came back. And I was sharing the story about what happened. So Chad now doesn't qualify for the Hope Scholarship. We held him out because if I would have signed the check and enrolled my son into Middle Tennessee State, that disqualifies him as a Hope Scholarship recipient for good. A lot of parents don't know that. If I would have wrote the check and he was enrolled, Hope Scholarship would have been gone forever. So I held him out for this fall. He's retaken the ACT test to get at least a 21. He's 1 point behind. He's got a 20, and we're sending him in to try to get him prepared for ACT. It's a system test. We all know what the ACT and ACTs are all about. So I went back to the Williamson County Board, and I said, where does it tell me as a parent that my son has a 2.8? So every report card that I've pulled for 4 years doesn't show it. There's no state GPA on his report card, progress report. I questioned that. Why? No answer. So then we come in and said, can we have a copy of the transcripts, his college transcripts? Guess what? Nowhere on here does it show a 2.8. It shows a 3.3. This goes to all the colleges that he applied to. Out of state, doesn't matter because we're taking advantage of the Hope Scholarship. I'm born and raised in Tennessee. It's an incentive. It's a great program for students to use. In today's economy, $20,000 is a lot of money. And anybody that doesn't agree to that, hats off to you. So I asked the question back to Dr. Looney. And I said, why isn't the GPA listed, both GPAs, listed on the transcripts and report cards? This is back in May. To this day, to this minute, I have not received an answer. That's wrong. So he tells me, David, you're supposed to know this. You're a parent, Williamson County. We told your son in classes, homeroom, these kids come in at 8 o'clock, they're half asleep. The teacher comes in and tells them something. I'm not sure if they comprehend what they just heard. Number two, there's PowerPoint presentations that they supposedly give to parents' nights. Number 3, it's on the parent portal. Everything's going internet. And the last comment today from the school is, David, you should have known this. We've been doing this for years. Well, my son is only a junior and a senior for 2 years. People who have kids in here that are 5th grade, 6th grade, you're not paying attention to this. It's the parents who have seniors or juniors. They better beware on this because it is a major problem. So they told me, Dave, we've been doing this for years. And I said, well, times have changed. This is what Gary and I were talking about. Back in our days in college at Tennessee Tech, we had a 4.0 scale. I think most all of us grew up on a 4.0 scale. When you start hearing 4.5s and 5.0 scales, things don't add up. So it's confusing for a parent to understand that, especially a student. But to take that, and this is why I use this analogy. I told my son, if you graduate from high school with honors, I'll get you a watch, Rolex watch. And when I found out that he graduated with honors, 3.3, 3.5, he's up there. I said, man, that's great. So I come in and I say, gosh, here it is, Chad. And I give it to him. I give it to him, and he takes it, and I said, Chad, I got something to tell you. It's a fake Rolex. That's what Brentwood High School did to Chad. Crushed him. He shut the book. He says, what do I do now? I've worked for 12 years to get this, and now I'm being told I'm not an honor student in the state of Tennessee. I got a 2.8, but Brentwood says I am. So I went and told Channel 5. Now I'm going to show this little clip because locally they played this in Nashville. I'll say, where's Lindsay still? Let me see if I get this to work here. Here we go. It's going to have a commercial in this. This is Channel 5.
How would you like to win energy-saving replacement windows? American Home Design is drawing our next local Middle Tennessee winner in our home makeover giveaway on November 2nd. Hurry, time's running out. Click here now to enter.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Scott Arnold. A Williamson County honors student should be getting ready to start college in just a few weeks, but instead, his dreams are on hold tonight, all because the Hope Scholarship he was expecting fell through. News Channel 5's Andrea Klein-Thomas tells us about the technicality that could keep him from more than $20,000.
Yes, Scott, you know, these days, every little bit of money that you can get for college, it all adds up. So Williamson County family has a warning to others across the mid-state. Your child's grade point average may not be as good as you think. Chadwick Beam was a high school freshman when he started prestigious Clips Lawn Care Company. The young entrepreneur has aspirations of going to MTSU and majoring in business.
Had all A's and B's in all of my classes.
Now those plans have to be postponed.
They gave him the high school diploma, which it does say honors, which we're proud of him to say honors.
Chad graduated from Brentwood High School, an honors student with a 3.3 grade point average, or GPA.
Parents need to know.
When David Beam went to pay for his son's first semester at college, he didn't see a credit for the Hope Scholarship. The Hope Scholarship awards incoming freshmen like Chad with up to $6,000 a year if they have a minimum 3.0 weighted GPA or at least a 21 on the ACT. MTSU told David Beam his son didn't qualify.
You're wrong. I said, I've got his report card right here, and his report card, it says his current cycle was a 3.58, but his overall weighted GPA is a 3.3.
Since 2004, students in Williamson County receive extra points for taking more difficult classes. So a final grade of 97% is considered a 4.0 GPA for a regular class, 4.5 for honors, and 5.0 for an advanced placement or international baccalaureate course. But according to the state's calculation, which is different, Chad has a 2.8.
But no, I put myself in the situation to have all honors classes and yet I get penalized for it.
As parents say, all of this could have been avoided.
I think the easiest fix would be to announce a state GPA on the report card.
Chad will still go to college, but for others without the Hope Scholarship, the news could crush that possibility.
Chad's just going to postpone going to MTSU so he can retake the ACT in hopes of qualifying for the scholarship. We're talking about more than $20,000 over 4 years, and his parents say that's too much money just to turn their back on.
Wow, fascinating story. We wish him the best, Andre. Thanks for the update. Appreciate it. All right, and Williamson County leaders insist tonight the policy and the differences with the states is communicated to parents and students. Meantime, Metro schools just announced this year they will also weigh the GPA for students who take harder classes.
So with all that, I wanted to play that because it's amazing how many parents called me after that was shown. So my question, it seems like an easy fix to me. Why wouldn't Williamson County list out on the progress report for the student, why wouldn't they list out the state GPA and the school GPA? And I cannot get an answer. And this is where Gary and we're all sitting there scratching our heads, and we can all think why Williamson County does it. I mean, ever since I've moved up here, the best schools in Middle Tennessee is Williamson County. It's a business. Draws a lot of people into Williamson County. Houses are built. Malls are built, great school system. But I'm here to tell you, this is not right. Not to use our students to grow our economy for Williamson County. Metro, I believe, I'm not sure if there's a Metro school board person. I understand they're listing out both GPAs on the progress reports. Knoxville, both GPAs are listed, correct? My sisters live in Knoxville. So when I share this story across the state into Tennessee, Knoxville, they're saying, Dave, it's wrong. And being from Tennessee, I was raised, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If nobody hears any squeaking going on, everybody's going to drive right past you. But I'm squeaking. And I'm wanting to voice my opinion to Williamson County, which they're just not communicating to me. They put a wall up on me. Board members are not told to talk to me from the Williamson County. So I really appreciate the opportunity for this and to hopefully share this because I know it's charter schools are coming up. All this, the one son I had, AP classes have grown double in 4 years. Honor classes have grown double in 4 years. To have Williamson County come and tell me, oh, we've been doing this for years. No. AP classes and honor classes has not been the case. They're growing now because people are saying, hey, you can get a good looking GPA from Williamson County and get a 3.6, 3.8 when you really got a 3.1 or 3.2. Your colleges don't see that. This is Tennessee. This is our school. This is our state. I want to take advantage of the lottery scholarship for my kids. And I'm aggravated with it, as you can probably tell. Having 90 seconds at Williamson County was hard. I tried to get it out in 90 seconds. My Rolex watch story didn't go over too well, but I hope this is giving you guys a clear picture of what's happening. And it potentially, if it's grown that much year to date, the AP and honors, what's it going to do in 2 more years? You're going, especially with Metro now having this growth.
Okay, David, I appreciate you being. Are there questions?
Yeah, just one. I'm sorry that phone went off.
Oh, that's fine.
Have you found out what is the difference? I might have missed that. The university lowered the GPA that the high school gave. How did they do that?
In order to receive the Hope Scholarship, you had to have a 21 on the ACT or a 3.0 on your
Uniform
grade
grade.
point.
Uniform
But he
grade,
had
not
the,
the-
he had the 3 point.
We thought he did.
Yeah, now what was that difference? How did they calculate it different?
Let me try to explain that. When we were developing a uniform grading scale, we polled the school districts. There are two options really. One, you can use a 4-point scale and you can add points to the score for an AP class. And we actually add, I believe it's 10 points, I don't remember for sure, 5 points for an AP and 3 for an honors. So if they had an 89, they would have a 94 for that marking period. That's one way to weight. And that's what the majority of the school districts across the state preferred. And that's what the committee recommended, and that's what you approved. And that calculation is to be done in calculating the GPA for the Hope Lottery Scholarship. Now, we did not go, the other option was to have a weighted GPA with a 1 grade and a different scale. 4 point for the A and regular, 4.5 for honors, 5 point scale for AP or IB. The majority of Tennessee systems did not prefer that, and so we didn't go that direction when we brought a recommendation to this board. It's been on, I think it was about 2005 when you approved this. So they have used the 4, 4.5 to 5 scale to calculate their GPAs for non-lottery purposes, which is permissible within the uniform grading scale. And then they do the calculation according to the uniform grading scale and report that for lottery scholarship purposes. There is where the 2.8 comes in.
Not really.
Clear?
No, it's not clear. Why the 3.3 and 3.3?
That's a 4.0 scale. And that's what back when we were in school, you know, a 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, and that's where back in the days it was kept simple, the KISS method. It was simple. But when they started honoring 2 extra points for honor classes and 3 extra points for AP classes, that's when the difference began. That's when things started to get diluted and confusing.
But I mean, okay, so you had a 90 and then you took AP, so you had a 93. So that gets you up to an A if it's a 93 to, so I guess that's what I don't understand about 4 point versus.
On the 5 point scale, they don't add points to the grade. They use the 89, and because 89 was a B, then it gets 4.5 points in an honor. It's 3.5 points in an honors.
Right.
It gets an extra 0.5 point to go in instead of a 3.0, it gets 3.5 in. There are 2 different ways of weighting to encourage students to take different courses.
And the key thing here is that you need some kind of uniform system to award the Hope Scholarship across the state. Everybody's got to be using the same thing. And that's what we did. And then left open, though, the opportunity for systems to use other scales if they want to. But the intent was that if they used some other scale, they were going to appropriately communicate, you know, what was going on and whether the student was qualifying for Hope or not. And that's, you know, that's where the deficiency is here.
And the fix is this right here. This is the progress reports that come out every 9 weeks. All it has right here is current cycle GPA. Wait, there's nowhere on here. They can just squeeze another line right here and put it in. I can't get an answer. Why don't they do that? Because they don't want to show that number.
Does everybody understand, you know, kind of what?
Yeah.
Well, what I think we need to do is ask Gary and staff to take a look at this and one, see where we are. Right, say we've got this problem other places, and whether we need to do something in the way of rules or whatever to address the situation. Mike, did you?
Yeah.
I imagine that when the decision was made to go with 4 point is that out of the 140 whatever school districts, very few had much offerings in AP or even honors. The thing that is dangerous about this is really, because David, I'm sitting here wondering how many parents would look at that differential and say, I want to shove my kids back down into college prep, which incidentally isn't, and in order to have a easier ride in high school, be easier eligible for the Hope Scholarship, but a whole lot less likelihood they're going to be able to master college work.
Right.
Your son, by taking those more aggressive courses, are more prepared for college, but the state is penalizing that extra for the very reason that the Hope Scholarship had a threshold in it in the first place.
And Mike, your argument there is exactly the reason the committee recommended the 4-point scale, but adding points too.
But the adding the points too is not getting recognized by the Hope Scholarship.
No, it does. Adding the points to it.
It changes that B to an A.
Yeah.
Now, he took honors courses, and under honors courses he had a 3.3, but when you take it down, am I right or wrong? But when you take it down to a 4-point deal,
At a 2A.
that A it gets adjusted down to a 2.8, so he gets penalized for taking that hard course.
So he should have.
He got credit under both for taking the honors course, I think.
He didn't get the Hope Scholarship for taking both.
He didn't get as much credit under the uniform grading scale as he did under the 5-point scale.
He would have gotten the Hope Scholarship if he had been in
regular
easier courses.
And if I had come in as a school district and said an A is 4 and an honors is 5 and an AP is 6, so you get even more exaggerated. So that's not control. So
Yeah, Chad even said that, so I didn't have to take honor classes. He would have taken regular classes, done well, and we wouldn't be fooling. He would have had a true 3.3. But since he took the honors, it hurt him.
Because he had to take a more rigorous course.
Oh yeah. Well, this is his senior year. You know, ecology, government. I mean, he did well. That's why. I mean, I was proud. I said, "Oh, you got it. You got it." And then when Williamson County said you should have known, this right here is what really upset me.
Right, and I think
They don't know about it.
to Mike, to your point, that's a valid point too. But there's an issue of communication and transparency with parents and students that concerns me.
Well, that's what David, as I understand, it is a communication that they don't necessarily want out there. It's a truth in advertising. Here is what and frankly, a lot of schools will look at that elevated grade because they recognize it as being college level courses or near college level courses. They certainly look at college prep with the jaundice eye, but the Hope Scholarship apparently doesn't recognize that more rigorous course list.
Well, my point is, if honors are preparing us for the ACT, we're going toward ACT, there's a discrepancy here between somebody that's a B student at least, and then the ACT, there's really a mixed match on the correlation there between ACT and AP or honors classes, which are supposedly to get you ready to take the ACT.
Yesterday I was out and about, and I spoke to a mother. She's got twins, seniors at Brentwood High School. Report cards came out yesterday, and I was asking, check to see what's listed on their report card. Well, it hasn't changed. Their kids are in the same boat, 3.2, 3.3 honor classes. I said, you better check it. She goes, how do I check it? So there's the communication breakdown. And what I was told, oh, you can go to parents portal and they give you a calculation, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, just tell me what he's got. Put it on the report card. Why should I be the person to decide his GPA? The school needs to give that information to us as a parent. But as far as communication, there's nothing out here that's properly. Emails don't work, PowerPoints don't work. I just showed it in here. 10 minutes, there's no way you guys can understand a formulary for GPAs. So,
Okay, Let's ask the staff to take a look at this, find out where we are, and obviously the environment has changed some since we put this in place, and if what we've got isn't working, we certainly need to fix it, and obviously deal with the communications. And David, we appreciate it.
All right, we need to, we'll have some discussions with registrars and different universities to kind of see how prevalent this issue, how often they run into it.
That sort of goes with my question, which is, do we have a way through our data system to know how many students might be affected? Or how many might have not gotten the Hope Scholarship because of this weighted
I
score
don't think
difference?
so.
There's not a way to know that.
I don't think so either. We know how many take AP courses and IB courses. I don't know that we've got any data system that sort of tracks how many districts are weighting their own grades differently. Not that I'm aware of. We'll check into it though.
Well, thank you for your time here. 90 seconds, Monday night at Williams County was hard to do, but this has been very pleasant. I appreciate this. If anybody wants to contact me, ask me more questions about it, feel free to, because I know this is the beginning of another hurdle. Times are changing, and so we have to address it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Okay, Common Core implementation update. Emily?
Yes, sir. Here you go. Pass those down. I don't know that we have enough for the full audience, but I'm very pleased today. Oh, there's more over there. Great. So these are coming around. Very pleased today to share with you all an update on our work on Common Core implementation, and I thought it would also be fruitful for us to spend a few minutes actually looking at some of the released PARCC items. I know that it's a topic of great interest. So this is not up on the board, but it's all here in the deck. On slide 1, the second page, this is in line with the goals of the state board and the goals of the department, but we really see the transition to Common Core state standards as central to strengthening Tennessee's competitiveness. And we know that come PARCC, we will actually see our results reported at the school and district level in comparison with all PARCC states. So instead of a district just having their data as compared to other Tennessee districts, we will be part of a consortia of 23 districts, or 23 states, and districts will see how they compare across those. Students will know how they're comparing across those. So we think that apples to apples comparison is great, but it's transparent, and I think we all know employers are going to look at that and say, where am I going to locate my plant? Where am I going to locate? So we want to use the transition to Common Core state standards to really strengthen our student achievement. PARCC will begin in the 2014-15 school year, and it will assess math, reading, and writing. Science and social studies at that point will continue with TCAP. In 2014-15, yes. There's another set of questions about science and social studies that this board will get to entertain in time around standards adoption, but at this point in time, the plan is TCAP will continue. Okay. The Common Core state standards have 3 really big shifts in math and 3 big shifts in English language arts. So when you look at our current standards and then you look at the Common Core, there's 3 big differences. The first in math is thankfully focus. So right now we have 113 standards in 3rd grade alone. So you have to teach a standard a day, essentially. And I think we all can see the effect that has for students on racing through the curriculum without that mastery. In 3rd grade, there are 25 Common Core standards. So we're significantly narrowing the scope. The grain size of the standards is a little bit bigger. It requires sort of deeper thinking. But focus is the most important shift because it makes possible the other 2. Coherence is really about linking topics within a grade level. So standards, in order to meet the expectations of the standards, students will have to make meaning of connections They'll have to be able to connect area with multiplication or measurement and fractions. That is not something our standards do right now. Our standards right now are more of a checklist of discrete skills. And then the third big change in math is rigor. And there are three components to this. One is conceptual understanding. In order to meet the standards, students have to explain why things happen mathematically. That's not true of our standards right now. The second is procedural skill and fluency. Our standards right now certainly speak to procedure, knowing, first do this, second do this, third do this. But we don't have fluency expectations where it's, can they do it with speed and accuracy? And the Common Core standards will require that. And then the third is application with intensity. In English language arts, the three big shifts when you look at the standards, the first is building knowledge through nonfiction and informational texts. Our standards are silent as to whether students should be reading fiction or nonfiction, and the Common Core state standards are very specific about the balance of fiction and nonfiction that students will need to engage with. In the elementary grades, we're looking at a 50-50 balance. So right now, if you look at elementary school libraries, they are typically predominantly fiction. And many people believe that this will lead to a real rebirth in science and social studies content in elementary grades, but it will come through literacy, so reading and making sense of that. You'll see some examples in the PARCC items. The second is writing and reading to sources. So instead of open-ended writing prompts where it's like describe what it means to celebrate and how you celebrate, having to read a text, cite evidence from that text in writing and in discussion. And that's really a career and college ready skill. That's what we have to do in our jobs. That's what you have to do in post-secondary institutions. So there's a lot of evidence from the text emphasis. And then the third big shift is the standards are very specific about text complexity and the importance of students engaging with complex texts. Right now there's about a 4-year divide between the text complexity of what students are interacting with in 12th grade and then what they have to interact with when they get to post-secondary. And so the standards work to sort of staircase up the complexity that students are working with over time. So I wanted to give that foundation just so you can now dive into looking at some items and see how these changes are in practice.
Before we move on, let me ask you, will the TCAP assessments be aligned with Common Core by then?
So we're going to look at the assessment transition in a moment, but we are not, we're narrowing the TCAP. We are not overhauling the TCAP. The PARCC assessment, which will begin in 14-15, will be fully aligned to Common Core state standards.
So when you say, tell me again what you mean by science, the TCAP piece.
So if you look at slide 2, right now we have current assessments in math, reading, writing, science, and social studies, grades 3 through 8, and then also an end of course series. In 2014-15, we will have 2 sets of assessments, the PARCC assessment, and the PARCC assessment will measure and replace the math, reading, and writing. So we will no longer have a TCAP in math, reading, and writing in 2014-15. We will move to PARCC.
That would be the common assessment for states.
Yeah, but it may be obvious now. And is there not a PARCC for science, for social studies? Is there what's the reason?
Sure. So this board has adopted Common Core state standards, and that applies only to math, reading, and writing. This board has not yet adopted any common standards around science or social studies. So science, there is a significant effort underway right now to, they've published draft standards. I think they're getting comments back, and that will be something for you all to consider as we move into the spring.
Emily, will those be aligned to those science standards and social studies standards be aligned to PARCC?
No, PARCC is only developing the assessment right now for Common Core state standards, which are just math, reading, and writing. There is an assessment consortia that will develop to assess the common science standards. And right now, sources tell me we're looking at 2016-17 before that assessment is available for states. Social studies, I actually just got an email, and there are draft social studies standards in the works. They are set to be released for public comment in the next couple of months. We've participated in the construction of those, but again, I think there's a real discussion to be had about whether we want to continue with state standards or common standards in social studies, and that decision has not been made.
That's a huge issue, though, you know, as we look at the needs of our state and making sure that our science and social studies, you know, standards have the rigor and the focus, you know, that we're going to see in Common Core.
Yes, absolutely. And the one thing to note, the Common Core state standards do include literacy standards that apply to science, social studies, and career and technical education teachers. So subjects that have significant literacy included. So as the science people are working, they are looking at those literacy standards to reflect. So quickly, I thought it would be good to actually look at sort of what are some sample questions coming with PARCC that we need to be getting our students ready for, and then I'll run through our transition plan. This first is a 6th grade English language arts sample, so students would read Julie of the Wolves, and then there's a writing assignment where the student would need to write an original story to continue where the passage ended. In your story, to be sure to use what you've learned about the character as you tell what happens to her next. So that gets at that text-based, evidence-based type of writing. It's not just narrative where you're inventing a story, it's actually consulting a text. I think this next page is a good illustration of text-based responses as well. Choose one word that describes MEACS based on the evidence from the text. There is more than one correct choice listed below. And then find a sentence in the passage with details that support your response to Part A. Click on that sentence and drag and drop it into the box below. Find a second sentence that does the same. The next page is a 3rd grade item. After reading How Animals Live, drag the words from the box below into the correct locations on the graphic to show the life cycle of a butterfly, as described in this passage. I was in a school on Monday, and I was walking in the hall, and they had student projects of this question where they'd all put up the life cycle of the butterfly and clearly been working with us. But a few things just to note here. This is an informational text, so it's a science text, and students are explicitly learning to build knowledge through reading. It's also, I think it shows how the online testing might look quite different and actually be very interactive, and you could imagine kids almost having fun doing that. A few math items. This is a 3rd grade item. Drag each fraction to the correct location on the number line. I think this also demonstrates the kind of conceptual understanding that students need to have when you think about 6/2 being one of the fractions. And this is a machine scoreable item, but it's not selected response, right? The students could put each dot in an infinite number of places along that line, but there's only one right answer, and the computer will know it immediately. This 7th grade item is the one that I've been told daunts teachers tremendously. There's 4 different objects. 2 are graphs, 2 are tables. Drag the objects in order from greatest speed to least speed. Lots of ways that could be solved. Unit rate, you could create common tables. And then a high school example. So there are multiple solutions in this, a positive and negative, and you could click on the fraction to enter another solution. Again, this is machine scoreable, but it's not selected response. So process of elimination isn't going to really help you. You don't have a 25% chance of getting that one right. Any questions about the instructional shifts or the sample items or PARCC before I talk through our own work? How do you feel about those items?
Good.
So on slide 10, I think we've shared this once before, but we really want to make sure that we are using the transition to strengthen student achievement. At the LEAD conference last week, I asked educators to think of how many standards transitions they've been through, and to stand up if they've been through one, to stay standing if it was 2, to stay standing if it was 3, and I think we made it to 7. So many teachers are used to going through the change of standards, and I think there's a fairly broad research base that suggests that there's very little change in student achievement when you change standards, typically. And I think the reason is it becomes this great binder replacement, where you take out the old standards, you put in the new standards, you keep doing things exactly the same way, you just call it something different. And if we treat it that way, we will miss the opportunity to strengthen student achievement through this transition and really prepare for the PARCC assessment. So there are 3 things that we are focused on in combination that we think will prevent it from being just another binder replacement. The first is assessment alignment and transparency. I do think teachers understand the standards best by seeing student expectations. So just reading the standards often doesn't make clear what's different and what's the same. It's actually seeing the assessment that makes clear, oh, wait a second, this is a different thing than I thought. So we're placing a premium on that. The second is instructional materials and curriculum. We know that what you see in the textbook is going to guide a lot of the kinds of teaching strategies and questions that teachers will ask. And we need to have good curricular materials. And finally, training and support. But I think it's safe to say we think you could do the best training that this world has ever seen. And if it's not coupled with these other 2 interventions, teachers will go back into their classrooms and eventually revert to their current behaviors. So we have to do all 3, supported with accountability and effective communication. We also think that principals are key, that principals can either reinforce or contradict, and that teachers will take their lead from principals. So we're placing a real focus on leader training. So, Serge, your question about the assessment transition. This slide 12 depicts our transition of assessments in math, and we are looking at a similar approach in ELA and reading. We have narrowed the TCAP exam by 15 to 25% in grades 3 through 8. So we identified the standards that are not reflected on Common Core, and we have, after reviewing psychometric research that told us that there would be really no change in student ranking, we have removed those student performance indicators to give teachers the ability to focus. We've then expanded the constructed response assessment, which is a essentially no stakes, low stake assessment, to focus on key focus standards within math. And on the next slide, you will see that we've expanded it from just 3rd and 7th grade, focused on both math and ELA, to be focused on only math standards 3rd through 8th grade. And it is administered 3 times throughout the year. So as we speak, students are taking the constructed response assessment in classrooms around the state for the first window. The October, on slide 14, the October and February administrations of the constructed response assessment are scored by teachers. Because getting in there and really looking at the scoring guides, looking at student work, we believe to be the right professional development for people to really understand what the standards are going to expect. The May assessment will be officially scored by our partner Measurement, and it will be reported, but it is not part of teacher or school accountability. So it's not part of value added, not part of school or district AMOs. However, it is our key mechanism for getting ready for PARCC. We've also made some changes to the writing assessment. Previously, our writing assessment questions were open-ended prompts. An example would be, imagine you're on a deserted island and you have a day to do whatever you want. Describe what you would do. We have moved, because PARCC is coming, to text-based prompts. That is the structure of the writing that students will have to do on PARCC. And so at every grade level, they are text-based. They are the same genre structure this year. So narrative in 5th grade, expository in middle school, and persuasive in high school. However, next year, because on Park it will be any genre, any year, we will move to mix it up. So students could get any genre next year. We're encouraging 4th, 7th, and 10th grade teachers to begin teaching all genres rather than just focusing on single genres to prepare those students. And the 8th and 11th grade administrations will be online only. We'll have a paper backup for students with accommodations, and in the dire situation that a district is unable to do so, it's a 1-week window. This is a chance for us to start moving towards online assessments in a low-stakes manner prior to Park, because we know Park will be online.
What's a text-based prompt?
So we have 3 examples released online, and I'm happy to send it around. But basically, students have to read something, and then the writing they have to do has to reference what they've read. So there's an example in 5th grade of a short passage about Paul Revere. And students have to read the Paul Revere passage, and then the question says, describe, if you were Paul Revere on this journey, describe, what the experience would have been like. Use evidence from the text.
Can you go over the online part again?
Mm-hmm. So previously, all of our writing assessments have been paper-based. Park will be online fully. And the Common Core state standards have explicit expectations around keyboarding skills, because we know that is where the world is. That's where the jobs of today, that's the kind of communication required in career and in college. So in order to move towards online assessment, we have moved the writing assessment online in 8th and 11th grade this year. It is optional to be online in 5th grade as well. That will continue next year, and then Park will fully begin in 14-15.
Mike, there is a long discussion about readiness for online assessment across the state, and it might actually, at the next board workshop, be good for us to do a report on where we are, where we need to get all the information that we have. We put extensive time and energy into this, and this is something that every state is grappling with. And it'd probably be good for us to give you a full report on where we are, where we need to be, what's the delta, how are we going to close the delta.
Well, where I'm sitting here thinking, knowing that procurement's going to be involved, let alone appropriation. This is October, and this stuff's going to have to be in place well before this time next year. So there's going to be slippage. I don't know what the plan is. So in addition to what the new target would be, unless there's going to be some extraordinary happenings between now and 10 months from now, what's our plan for the slippage?
Yeah, I think we can report all of that. What's our plan A? What's our plan B? All those things. The broad answer is there is going to be a paper backup for the Park assessment. But the reality is we need to get as many schools as possible into the online assessment.
Well, the thing that worries me about the paper backup is that we're really, I've asked, but I'm not sure when value add is going to hit the school districts. If they've got, Knox has gotten it now, and they've gotten it in the last recent time, but not the quick schools. But,
meaning for teachers or for school? Because they get it right now on June 15th.
The value add?
Yeah.
Not the quick school.
Right. June 15, everybody got value added scores this year.
So we'll be able to reduce that window when we go online, though, right?
Yes. Probably.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of, Park hasn't made commitments on when scores come back, but theoretically, online assessment results come back faster.
With Park, there will be a performance-based assessment, and which will have to be human scored at some level because it's like the writing and the research simulation. And then there's the machine scored component, which is when we give TCAP, and that will come back pretty instantly. Lots of fun. A quick update on instructional materials, and then I just want to preview what we're doing on training. Tomorrow you all will be presented with the approved list for the reading textbook adoption. And we have taken the content review of the reading and the literature textbooks very, very seriously. We've created a rubric with Student Achievement Partners, which is the group that represents some of the writers of the standards. And we had a committee do a thorough review of some non-negotiable components, as well as a very high expectation for alignment, particularly with these shifts. So we looked closely at the balance of informational and fictional text, text-based questions. Do the reading materials reflect that? And the materials that will come to you for approval have been through that vetting and have met those non-negotiable requirements. We also published a follow-up review of the approved literature options so that districts could see where the strengths and gaps were against Common Core alignment. And we are in the process of looking to work with other states to do a review of our math textbooks so that the states together can come out with information about the alignment and link arms in that project. We are also providing independently some math tasks throughout this year. We're taking very seriously getting good resources into the hands of teachers. This past summer, we conducted a training in 3-8 math, and we trained almost 13,000 teachers across the state. We used a peer-developed model, so we hired core coaches who were excellent teachers, trained them very deeply, and then they trained their peers. Overall, we've had very positive reviews on this training from across the state and comments about the quality and the consistency of it. As we prepare for full implementation next year, we are looking at doing full trainings in 4 areas. K-8 math follow-up. There is more work to do to make sure everyone is ready. 9-12 math. K-5 reading. It will cover all of English language arts, but deeply focus on reading instruction. And then 6-12 English language arts and literacy. These will span 2 to 4 days, and essentially June is math month and July is English arts month. The number of slots we're going to be able to offer each school and district will depend on our ability to find good core coaches. Because we cannot compromise on the quality of the trainers. We know that the quality of the trainer directly results in the quality of the training. And so we will launch the application process for core coaches on October 30th, so next Monday or Tuesday. And if we are able to find the maximum number of coaches that we're looking for, we will be able to offer a number of slots to each school and district. And overall, the projections are just shy of 30,000 participants in the training overall. However, if we can't find the needed number of coaches, then that will have to go down. And then just a summary of the key dates. We launch applications, and we have a formal process for schools and districts to apply to be training sites this year. And then our final allocations for schools will be announced on February 5th. All of our communications about Common Core is channeled through our TNCore website. I don't know if you've had an opportunity, but we're trying to be very thoughtful curators of the content on that, so it doesn't become, the kitchen sink of Common Core, but it's only the best resources that are out there. We also have started doing bi-weekly updates on anything related to Common Core to district teams of 5. And then we have a 24-hour sort of hotline for Common Core questions at the TNCore.questions email account.
Kelly, I just have one question. I think this is great progress, and really looking forward to seeing this move forward. What are we doing to engage parents and students, and what kind of community coalitions do we need to create on the ground?
I think that's a great question. SCORE has revived the Expect More, Achieve More campaign with a focus on the Common Core transition. And they have produced a really great 5-minute video that lays some of the foundation. And they have engaged, I believe at this point, it's 70 different organizations in the Expect More, Achieve More coalition. The PTA, National PTA, has a website with some fairly strong resources explaining Common Core to parents, and we've been linking to that off of our TIMCore site and when districts ask for parent resources. We also produced a very short video for parents explaining some of the changes they might see this year in assessment. So we've changed the constructive response assessment, we've changed this writing assessment. Here are some of the things you might think about doing. But the truth is that I don't think that represents a thorough campaign for engaging students and parents in the transition, and I think it's worthy of more discussion.
Any other questions? Yes, Gene.
I guess just in my mind, I'm trying to understand how an online can grade writing. You know, is it keywords? How they do the sequence of the story?
So there's sort of two answers to that. The writing components of the Common Core, or of the PARCC assessment, are folded into what's called the performance-based assessment, which will be given more in the sort of February or March timeline, and then scored by humans. So it gets uploaded online, but then I think the scoring process will look a lot like the AP scoring process, where AP exams get scored by sort of a committee of teachers who have been thoroughly trained. However, there is actually very promising artificial intelligence technology that has done a slightly better job than human scoring at scoring for certain components of writing. It can't get at tone and feel, but it can get at structure and grammar and a number of those things better than human scoring. You have to train the engine with like thousands of student work samples that have first been human scored. But once it gets trained, it can do it very, very quickly. And we are looking at, is there a way for us to get access to some great AI technology so that teachers can use it in the lead up to PARCC? Because right now I think the chief constraint on writing instruction is grading. You know, it's very hard for people to go through and grade everything. Is there a way that we could leverage technology to do that better? But right now, the plans for PARCC scoring are to include human scoring of the writing sections.
Any other questions? Okay, great job.
Thank you.
I think it's an extremely important subject, and I think you're making good progress. I think it would be helpful to hear the next workshop about the technology and the plans there. But I got a feeling that's a big challenge also.
A huge challenge, and one that's really front and center for districts right now.
Okay, anything else there? Okay, let's move to the AP, IB, inclusion and school accountability. Aaron?
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about this issue and tell you sort of where we are, and then can take questions as you all have them. So as you know, when you last fall passed this policy around students who are enrolled in a course that has an end of course assessment but also has some sort of substituting assessment such as an AP test, an IB test, etc., that student should only be taking that substituting assessment and then not the associated end of course test. We then looked into, for you all, making sure that we could try and not affect value added and accountability as much as possible with that change in policy. So we had decent success this past year on the 8th grade students and 7th grade students who might be taking some sort of test that would have an associated end of course. So for algebra students, we were able to include those students who took algebra prior to the high school in the 3-8 math calculations for accountability. We also are able to do value added for those places where there is a test such as Algebra 1. So we're moving forward on that. With those students who are taking physical science and geometry prior to the end of course test and they're in the 7th or 8th grade, we don't have an associated end of course test for physical science or geometry. So what we did last year for this with districts was to say it's your option as to whether or not a student who's enrolled in physical science or geometry, you would choose to test on the achievement test for the appropriate grade for that student in grades 3 through 8. We are planning to go forward with that again this year, essentially leave that choice up to districts. Districts had, last year was about 50-50 with districts who chose to test or chose not to test in those particular subjects, and people had really strong arguments and opinions both ways. And so we think this is an important thing to just sort of leave up to districts to make that decision on their own. So we plan on continuing with that going forward as well. As it relates to the question of AP, IB, dual enrollment, the high school end of course tests and those students. So it's important to us that we make sure that students who are enrolled in those courses are taking some sort of assessment. So what we're proposing to do related to those for this year is to actually say that any student who is enrolled in a course that has an associated end of course test, if they and a substitute test, if they are not taking the substitute test, i.e. they're enrolled in an AP course and they are not going to take the AP test, that they would then take the associated end of course test. So this will come up really, the biggest place that this comes up, well, two places really that are important from an accountability perspective. One is in accountability for English 3. That's really where this actually matters for accountability. Otherwise, when you're looking at, for example, U.S. history is not included in the accountability spectrum, so that is a place where it would matter really more for value added and those types of things. But we do think it's important that if there is a test that a student can be taking, if they're not taking the AP test, that they are taking that end of course test. So we would propose that that's how we deal with that set of things. We have had a lot of concern from districts that have high numbers of students that are enrolled in AP that we do try and figure out a way to include AP and other things in the accountability spectrum. That's actually proved more difficult to do than we would like for it to be. So one of the primary issues is around timing. So we don't actually get the scores back for AP students and AP tests until really late summer. And so that's after we would have already made district determinations, and it's after we've got the data to sort of set baselines for districts to make their goals for the next year. And so what we're looking at doing there is including AP for districts really sort of after we've looked at where they've ended up in accountability. So we look at where the district ended up in accountability. If they have a high percentage of students that are enrolled in AP and they for some reason have not made that particular, so again this will only matter for English 3. So if they say don't hit their English 3 target, but we think that there's a chance if you were to include the data we would get from AP, that would bump them up enough in sort of to a place where they would be able to hit that target, then we would hold on that district's determination until we see that data. I think it's pretty unlikely that that scenario happens other than 1 or 2 times, and we really would only want to be sure that we're looking at this when it would positively or negatively affect the district's overall determination, so moving them from one category to another. So from the accountability perspective, that's how we're looking to deal with that. As far as trying to include AP, IB, dual enrollment into value added, as I said, we were able to do this on Algebra 1. This is something we've talked with SAS about. It doesn't look to be possible to do value added around AP, IB, other tests. They just don't have the same. They don't have the same ability to create a value added measure around those tests based on some of the things that we get back in terms of the scoring. So that's an update really on where we are, how we're trying to address the issue from accountability, from value added perspectives. Happy to take any questions, concerns, etc.
Questions? Difficult area to totally grasp. Just a quick question: if you got a student who's taking Algebra 1, let's say 8th grade, do they take the TCAP?
No.
8th grade?
So they take just the Algebra 1 test.
Okay.
And we count that, and from an accountability perspective, we count that in the 3A math category for them. So we're basically what we're doing is.
So for value added, the algebra, the end of test does count in the calendar?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
For algebra tests that are taken whenever they're taken are counting in both accountability and in value added. The issue around value added is actually really only for AP, IB, dual enrollment, places where you don't have a test that's being taken that is a state administered test.
Right.
So anywhere there's a state administered test, we can include it in value added. The problem is when you get outside of that spectrum of tests and the properties of the tests make it more difficult to do.
Like history or something, right?
Mr. Chairman.
Like AP history. So U.S. history end of course test, no problem, can be included. AP U.S. history, we cannot include.
Mike?
So there is annual progress, and then there is reducing the gap, or not reducing.
Yep.
Is it only 3rd grade English that impacts, that comes into the calculation of reducing
Right, so when we look at
the differential?
When we look at the achievement side of the accountability system, we include 3rd grade reading and math, 7th grade reading and math, 3 through 8 reading and math. Algebra 1, we're going to start including Algebra 2. We include English 2, and we're going to start including English 3. So that's all of the tests that are used on the achievement side. On the gap closure side, we actually use the 3A math and reading for gap closure. And then we're looking at how we either combine Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 together to be the sort of high school math measure, and English 2 and English 3 together to be the high school reading English measure, or using just one set of both of those tests. But we're looking at the different possibilities for how we can include those.
So this is, in my kids' high school, they took something called Combined, which is a AP history English together, a sophomore year. And then their junior year, they had, well, actually they got an IB English too. But just thinking of that one school, which is really an urban school system, if those courses are not allowed to be calculated into the mix, there's going to be an artificial well of gap.
Well, no, because those students still take reading and math assessments.
If the school says, if they're taking AP course test at the end of the English sophomore, they're taking the AP, they're taking an IB assessment in the senior year because it's a 2-year deal. And if it's up to the, I guess you said it's up to the LEA to make the decision as to whether, but I don't know how you all are going to count it from the, because that sets with you all as to how you count the gap. Calculate the gap.
So a couple of separate issues, I think. One is when we're talking about district option, that's for physical science and geometry, which is generally only 8th grade, also can be 7th grade, right? When we're talking about AP courses, really from an accountability perspective, the only course that has an AP test that we are using from an accountability perspective would be English 3. So that's really the primary issue there, and it's a matter of sort of timing and when we get the results and being able to include it. And we understand where districts are coming from on this and where schools are coming from, and that you'd want to have those students be able to be included. I mean, at its core, that's sort of the crux of the policy issue here. Then I think sort of what you all are grappling with, which is that there's, for the students and for the teaching of the course, you want to be able to not have them have to shift gears and teach something that's going to be associated with the state test. But at the same time, when you do that, then you do have this problem where you struggle with being able to include that in an accountability system.
Well, to cut through it with me, you all got it worked out where everything's gonna be okay?
No.
I'm tired of-
Everything is not
my
going
brain's
to
hurting.
everything is not going to be okay on English 3 and AP. That's the place where we won't be able to make it okay. And we won't be able to make it okay for IB or dual enrollment. From an accountability perspective, and also from the perspective of value add.
So would the school be penalized because of that?
No, I think in the proper sense, no, because the baseline is going to be off of that same information. So your baseline is only off of the students that are included, and then your baseline to growth is only off of basically those same types of students. You will have a group of students that is not included. Those students
that are high performing.
Correct.
That could help.
Yeah. And we actually did sort of look at this, and if we were able to somehow include the test scores, which would mean that there are a couple of different, we could lag and all sorts of things, but you only get a very, very slight bump. It really, I think the likelihood of this actually affecting any district's overall accountability status is incredibly slim. And like I said, if it does, or it looks like it would, that's when we would try and hold that district's accountability status until we're able to say whether or not this could bump them up, essentially.
You do that on a case-by-case kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we'll have to do probably is to take a look at overall AP English enrollments and just make sure that as we go through final determinations, we check that list to make sure that there aren't districts that somehow fallen into in need of improvement or didn't make it into exemplary because of that. It'll not be pretty, but it'll be certainly possible.
Okay. Other questions? You comfortable, Mike? You've been assured that it's gonna be all right, right?
I think I heard the one gonna be all right.
Okay. Very good. Aaron, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Division of Special Education, Kathleen.
Did anybody else not get a copy of it?
It's very complicated. There's no perfect way to do it. You either just have to change too much for them to get included accountability, pick your poison.
Some more complications to add to your plate. Several weeks ago, I assumed the role of leading the special education division in the short term. We had our assistant commissioner of special populations step down. I've stepped into that role. And to give you all some reassurance, special education is my background. Before I went into administration, I spent several years as a special education teacher, high school level, trying to get children at that time to pass science and math courses that were then measured by a proficiency exam. So that's back a couple standards, right, Scott? Since then, I went into several areas of administration, and now at the State Department, special education fell under my leadership, and I've stepped into the role to lead that department, and we're in the process of negotiations for a new assistant commissioner. But what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about our accountability results in special education and frame the issues of why it is we need to make some dramatic changes to how we serve districts and how we serve students with disabilities to get different results. You all have seen this slide before. We know that the new accountability under the waiver looks at growth for all students every year and closing achievement gaps. So we saw the results of what that looked like in the various districts, and here's a picture of what the district reporting looked like. We had 21 districts that were exemplary, 57 that were intermediate, 3 that were in need of improvement overall, and 54 in subgroup need of improvement. Now, why am I showing you that? Because of this. Of those 54 districts in need of subgroup improvement, 36 were identified because of students with disabilities. It is our greatest challenge across the state in changing results. And you can see there's various other subgroups involved in various districts. However, the students with disabilities issue comes to the forefront as the greatest challenge. Again, under the waiver, we identify schools. We have priority schools, we have focus schools, and reward schools. And I want you to look at the line in the middle. In the focus schools, where we have the largest achievement gaps that are measured within schools, of the 167 schools that were identified, and that's 10% of our schools above priority, 65 of those were related to students with disabilities. And this next slide defines what that looks like. There was no one school that was identified solely for students with disabilities, but they fell into the category. Some you can see in the blue where there are students with disabilities and economic disadvantage. In the red category, students with disabilities, economic disadvantage, and ethnicity. In the smallest category, where all four subgroups fell into that lowest gap closure issue. And at the bottom, there's a note that does not show up in the graph, is that there were two schools that were identified for extremely poor performance for students with disabilities, where their subgroup was performing at less than 5% proficient. That's sad. And then this is the other issue that we look at the state. 15 of our 16 gap closure AMO targets were met, or excuse me, 5 of our 16 gap closure AMO targets were met, but none were met for students with disabilities. And you can see in the other categories, some we hit 1, some we hit 2, but for students with disabilities it was none. So lots of work to be done there. Part of the issue around identifying those systems that were targeted in needs of improvement were the fact that many districts last year over-tested in what we call our alternative assessment, which is the MAS test. And there's a lot of confusion that swirls around the testing of students with disabilities. What should happen by federal law and by state standard is that the majority of our students, 97%, should be tested on the typical test, the TCAP test or the end of course test, with modifications or accommodations written into that test. However, districts may identify a portion of students to test alternatively. And you can see that last year we had 11 districts that were moved into the category of in need of improvement because they over-tested. And what happens when we over-test, when we test too many students with the MAS test, those students are reassigned randomly back to a basic designation, which then in turn put 11 of our districts in that category of in need of improvement. We tested a lot of additional kids in special education in all 3 areas last year. You can see 6.5% more students were tested in achievement with accommodations in most cases. Almost 8% more took the MAS test, and about 7% more took the portfolio test. A portfolio test is 1% of students that have the most significant difficulties. They cannot take a paper and pencil test. That amounts to, I think, about 2,800 students. 2,807 students took the test last year with special education designation. And you can see it's not all bad news. These are gains that we made in every single area in every single test, but not enough gains to close gaps. So we did make some progress in achievement, in MAS, and in our portfolio designation, however, not enough. This is the report card achievement data that will be released later this month. The difference between how all students were measured in proficient and advanced and how students with disabilities were measured in proficient and advanced, and you can see in every single area it's significantly lower, extremely lower in Algebra 1, where only less than half of our students are performing proficiently. And then this is the gap data that will also be reported on. The new report card that will be released is the gap size and the gap closure that we're trying to meet. And you can see in 2010, 2011, that was the percentage gap on our TCAP testing between our students with disabilities and all students. And you can see that there were significant gaps, and then we have gap targets in the second column. and the gap reduction size varied between the 4 areas depending on the size of the gap. The percent gap size that we hit is in the last column, and you can see we did not hit our gap target. So for next year, our gap targets in the first 2, reading and math, will be a 1.2% improvement, a closure in gap, a smaller gap, and slightly higher in algebra and English.
Well, what happens
Yes, sir.
if we don't meet our gap target?
Well, then districts would be identified as in needs of improvement.
And what happens then?
Districts that were identified in needs of improvement have work around their plans with Race to the Top that they can create with their district improvement plan, with their scope of work for their Race to the Top plan, and that plan is devised to close gaps. So we're working with districts to help them close gaps.
Well, just out of theoretics.
Theoretics.
What happens if that doesn't work?
There's no, unlike AYP, there's no sort of there's no state takeover of a district or anything like that under the waiver. So it's all based on identification and then heightened levels of state intervention in strategic planning and execution.
That's with all of these targets components, right?
Right.
Correct. Thank you, Commissioner. So what are we doing about the gaps, which is your question? Some of the things that we're doing and we expect to have accomplished by January 13th, we're going through some staffing restructures, giving more significant guidance to districts around the testing issue, changing in our monitoring processes, data and support, which will look completely different, standards-based IEPs, K2, very specific guidelines on intervention, and let me walk you through each one of these. First of all, the staffing restructure. As I said, I'm now serving as the Assistant Commissioner in the interim position. We expect to have a new Assistant Commissioner appointed by January. Director of Monitoring and Support has been hired. Prior to this hire, monitoring and support was what I would call a checklist monitoring. We would be looking at specific APR requirements that come from USAID, but not necessarily instructional basis to that checklist. So we're changing and modifying what we're doing, particularly in that area. Same with our Director of Data Services. We hope to have someone hired by the end of this month. Typically, our data services person at the State Department under the Special Education Division was reporting up data to USAID, but not utilizing that data to inform how we guide districts. So we're reorganizing what that individual will do as they come in and looking for an individual with strong qualifications in that area. Some of the more significant changes we're looking at have to do with our core offices, and you may have heard a little bit about our core office staff and have been revamping and reorganizing that for the past several months. We now have data specialists in place, math specialists in place. We have core directors that have instructional basis and are intervening and helping with districts. And we're expecting to turn those 3 bullets, our regional directors, our management consultants, and our compliance monitors, shifting that work into the work of instructional support for our districts. This is a little bit about, to somewhat alleviate the confusion around standardized testing guidance. As I mentioned, modified assessments are for the most severe kids. 3% of the kids is the guideline, both from the federal government and the state, on how many students may take an alternative assessment. I showed you that there were, I think, 6 or 7% more students that took MOS from last year to this year. The year previous to that, there were 144% more students that were put into MOS, and it was a matter of many districts identifying students inappropriately for taking a test that was not exactly the test suited for that student. The MOS was specifically designed, as I said, for those students with disabilities who failed to meet participation rate for criteria for portfolio assessment. Portfolio is the 1% of students that are unable to take a paper and pencil test. 2% of students above that may be identified by a district to take an alternative assessment. Anywhere above the 3%, districts are have students reassigned back to that basic level of proficiency and accounted against the district for accountability. And we also put out guidance this year that if students were proficient or advanced on MOS last year, we are sending lists out to the districts and letting them know these students should be reassigned to TCAP testing this school year. Monitoring and support revisions, as I said, we're changing the format of what we're doing with monitoring and support. Typically what happened in districts, I would call it almost an invasive demonstration of State Department going into districts and digging through piles of paperwork and looking at paperwork that relate to student IEPs and other documents, but not really looking at instructional focus. We're narrowing that down to exactly what OSEP requires. We're going from a 3-year cycle to a 5-year cycle of monitoring, and everything starting in January until May will be a desktop monitoring rather than this invasion of State Department officials into a school district, and our districts are applauding that particular change. That's both with our record review, which is a web-based program, and our fiscal monitoring, which right now this year is going to require an upload of documents either by fax or scanning for us to review, but we are in preparation of adding by July of next year an online program that will allow us to do a fiscal monitoring as well as a web-based program. Data and support revisions. As I said, typically our data person at the State Department gathered data from districts and reported it to USED, and that was it. It was not necessarily shared at the department between our program directors, and it was not necessarily shared with districts on how they could improve instruction. So we're completely revising that division as well, or that department within the division as well. And the program directors will be responsible and accountable for their own data. Again, we want to get this information out to our core directors and new staff in those core offices that can use that data to define where are our best practices, who can we share out, is making the best efforts in closing gaps or hitting higher achievement. Standards-based IEPs, if you went into a district anywhere in Tennessee, you would see a real difference in how people write IEPs and what is in those IEPs for students. We are moving towards standard-based IEPs with the goal of this being completely tasked out by the time IEP season is in place, which is usually spring of every year in most districts. IEPs will be written to Common Core standards. All students with disabilities have the right to accommodations, and at that time, assessment will be determined, which is the most appropriate assessment with those accommodations. RTI support. This is foundational. This is information that we shared at LEAD conference recently, K2 guidelines and intervention support. Not necessarily that students are in special education in K2, but if we don't have children learn the basic foundation of reading and math between K and 2, they very well may end up in special education by grade 3, which is the highest grade for students to be identified and put into special education, where we start testing them on standardized tests and realize there's a significant deficit. One challenge with this is there's still a few districts in the state that have half-day kindergartens, and for those they won't be able to fit these specific guidelines. But we are advising districts now that this is the foundational core for teaching reading and math, and that science and social studies should be integrated into the ELA time and the math time. What are our long-term goals after January? Again, monitoring phase 2. We're working with some partners who have developed what we call performance-based documents. And I should probably not use the word monitoring. I don't plan to use this as we move forward, but some of the documents I've seen do use the word performance-based monitoring. What that is, it's not a compliance monitor that is required by OSEP, which is the Office of Special Education, but it's taking a look at best practices across the state and then doing a checklist analysis with each of our districts to determine, are you using these best practices to inform instruction for your district? So that piece will be in place by July moving forward. Looking at licensure revisions, and I know you're going to hear a little bit more about licensure revisions in the next presentation. I won't get too much into it other than the fact that right now special education teachers don't need to know a lot of content, and content teachers don't need to know a lot of special education, and there needs to be some coming together on this licensure issue. Inclusion of student scores for students with disabilities and teacher effect. This is part of the legislative package in support from teachers across the state. We've had several meetings with various supervisors of special education and those that will be affected. What that intends is that many times students with disabilities are the highest growing children. They might not hit that particular achievement target, but they are growing students, and teacher effects should be included in our teachers' scores. Decreasing the percentage of identified students. Tennessee has a problem. We have too many students identified as disabled. In the average across states is about 12%. We sit on the borderline of about 17% in our state. And again, that goes back to those foundational skills not being in place prior to third grade. Fiscal reorganization, one of the things that I'm looking at very carefully, and just now delving into this, is money flows into the state from USN to be reapportioned, how we use it at the department and how we distribute it to districts. And we have a challenge because we tend to, with our fiscal compensation to districts, reward those districts that have more students in special education getting more hours in special education rather than the reverse. It should be that our districts should be rewarded for having students in the general curriculum and being supported. Preparation for PARCC assessment. You heard Emily talk a little bit about Common Core and PARCC assessment. It's a great challenge, not only for all of our state with online testing and some of the other issues, but for students with disabilities, we're looking at some commonalities between states in PARCC assessment. And what I do know about our assessment in Tennessee versus other states' assessments is we give too many accommodations. Our test looks different than other states. It's a simpler test. And there are some accommodations that other states never allow that we allow in our state. So as we come together across states to decide what this needs to look like in an aligned assessment, there's going to be some differences that are noticeable very quickly as we move forward. And strategic plan development, I've been engaging in conversations with various individuals around the country about SEA reorganization around special education, and working on a strategic plan right now with a group. It's a think tank out of Boston. It's called District Management Council. And if you care to look up an individual, Nate Levison, you'll see a lot of research and analogies around changes and reform around special education. But the basic goal of the structure that we're working on is that in order to redesign what happens at the state level, we have to figure out first what are the desired outcomes at the district level. So we're starting backwards. Where do we want to end up, and what do we need to do at the State Department to get those results? So be glad to take any questions.
Questions for Kathleen?
Clarifications. Okay, on the MOS, then that means that the student gets some sort of modification to take the test.
A lot of people get confused between modification and accommodation. Every student with a disability has the right to an accommodation on any test. And the accommodations should look very similar to what the accommodations are for their teaching methodologies. So whether they take the MOS test or the TCAP test or an end-of-course test, they have those modifications. Accommodations. The modification means a change in the test. And not all states give a MOS test. That is our modified TCAP test in our state. And as we move to PARCC, it's unlikely that there will be a modified test. It will be a 1% portfolio, 99% of our kids taking the PARCC with accommodations, but without that change or modified test.
That makes more sense, because I thought if you have 100 students and only 2% get to have extra time, I don't understand how.
No.
But they keep the same.
Any student with a disability has accommodations allowable.
Our problem has been that the 1% that are allowed to take portfolio and 2% that are allowed to take MOS, that's a federal level rule. And it's, for the reasons that you would expect, to make sure that states and districts aren't gaming their results by removing students from their traditional testing regime. And our challenge is, and honestly, we take blame for this at the state level. I think over the past several years, the state has given districts poor guidance on this, and as a result, districts have steadily increased the number of students taking MOS until we as a state significantly exceeded where we needed to be on the 2%. And so, A, that's wrong. We shouldn't be pulling as many students out from taking the standard test. But B, it also wound up hurting our results because every student over 2% automatically gets put back into the TCAP pile but assigned as basic. So it actually, if you operate with the assumption as we do that a number of those students taking MOS could have scored proficient on TCAP if we'd done good work with them, then we're actually hurting our own results while also not doing right by the students.
And the other part that I would add to that, we are doing a great disservice to students to have them in a modified assessment now, and 2 years from now suddenly in a much more difficult test. That's a great disservice. I would clarify on the memo that was recently sent out to directors, shared with directors first, and then our special ed supervisors around the MOS guidance. I would call previous guidance somewhat what you might think of as shopping for the right answer. And depending on which person you talk to at the state, you might get a different answer 2 years ago. So what I've done is I've gathered accountability, curriculum instruction, the special education department, and created a document that everybody agrees this is always the answer every time a district calls on how we test with modified assessment.
I would just like to say thank you so much. I love the revisions you're making at the state level.
I'm pretty excited about that.
They're very much needed. But I have a question about going back to the testing for an individual student with a disability and trying to measure that student's growth from one year to the next. I know we're getting a lot of district information, but on that individual student, are the tests we are using with whatever modifications they're getting, are we showing that those students are growing?
If they take the TCAP test, that shows into our accountability growth. The loss is excluded from those growth measurements. I would say, as a district leader, and prior to that special education supervisor, what I required in TBOS, and this has been 10 years in place in Putnam County, is we attached all the TBOS growth scores to our IEPs. And we showed that to parents every single meeting and said, this is where your student was last year, this is where they are this year, this is why we need to change the instruction or provide a different sort of accommodation that might be useful to your son or daughter.
But are we measuring that subgroup on the TBOS for growth?
We are for schools and districts, but we're not for teachers. And the reason we're not for teachers is because it's barred by law. So it's currently barred by law to include special education students for individual teachers' TBOS scores. And we set to change that, and we think it needs to change. I just think students with disabilities are part of our charge, and we know and we've seen that they actually frequently grow a lot, and so there's no good reason to exclude them.
Yeah, and the other challenge with excluding those students from the scores of teachers, particularly where they're in a content classroom, I've had a teacher tell me to my face that they were not going to worry about that student because they didn't count in their teacher test score. You know, that's going to radically change how we take a look at every single child in the classroom.
And I would also add, again, at the state level, we would take responsibility and say that over the past few years, and probably going back well beyond that, we really haven't given general education teachers strong tools on how to differentiate instruction for students with disabilities. We have not provided great guidance that would help teachers excel. And so we actually think there's huge opportunity as we move from a compliance organization to a service organization. We think there's huge opportunity for us to provide much better tools to districts that will help teachers with instruction, because a lot of teachers are flying blind. We have a lot of general education teachers with students with disabilities in their classroom who have never received training on how to differentiate instruction.
This is one example of a fiscal misunderstanding for a lot of districts. Districts can use 15% of their funds to train teachers or to provide intervention programs for students prior to referral. And when I was a supervisor, I took those funds and used them to train teachers so that they could include students with disabilities. I felt that was going to make a bigger impact than spending that money totally on a population of students with disabilities. My goal was to lower that number to get more kids into content classes. But that's part of the fiscal guidance that needs to be better as we move forward with districts.
Any other questions? Okay, Kathleen, thank you. Great job. Appreciate it. Okay, next, leadership policy, teacher licensure standards. Sarah.
Sure. I'm gonna flip a few slides for you. While she's doing that, I want to say thank you again for the opportunity to provide a few key updates on some work streams that are happening across teachers and leaders. I brought a few of my fellow colleagues here to talk to you about a couple key things. First, licensure. We want to talk a little bit about where we are in the process for updating both licensure standards as well as program approval and the way we issue licenses themselves. There's a lot of work under we've talked about briefly at some of the past workshops, but want to update you on that. And then I also wanted Paul Fleming to talk to you a little bit. We haven't spent as much time on the leadership initiatives, and as we're thinking about where to put our focus on, Emily talked about the Common Core shifts. There's a related set of shifts that really need to happen in the way we think about leadership at the school level to manage the change that's required around Common Core, as well as the evaluation and some of the human capital changes that principals are faced with, given the different initiatives that we have at play across the state. And then if we have time, I also thought a brief update on evaluation year 2. We are in the process of implementing the changes that you passed this past summer, and wanted to give you a little bit of information as to some of the things that are happening to make sure that that's happening across the state. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy Wooten to give you a brief update on licensure, and then we'll turn it over to Paul.
So the last time we were here, we shared the same slide with you to let you know that we are focusing on revising what happens before our teachers get into classrooms. And the 3 buckets, as Sarah mentioned, are revising our licensure standards, reconsidering how we approve our preparation programs, and streamlining our licensing process. Currently, we have begun drafting a large number of our licensure standards, and we believe that these standards need to be fundamentally different from what we have right now. I think Emily said earlier, we don't want this to just be a switching of the binders and nothing really changes. And so getting new standards that are fundamentally different is really hard work. This is a different way of thinking. We're engaging lots of stakeholders in this process. And this is something that's not going to be an easy process, but we think it's going to be extremely worthwhile. We are going to be designing and drafting all the way through March, we anticipate, and we expect to bring you some revised standards in April. We want to make sure that whatever we bring you is very high quality, and that may mean that we have to prioritize which standards we bring to you in April. We want to focus right now we're going to focus especially on our core academic areas, our math and English language arts, make sure we're getting those in the shape that we want them, and then use those as models to help us continue to draft standards in the other areas. We will have a second phase of drafting our standards, and maybe even a third phase, depending on how many we get done before April this year. We hope that full implementation of those that we bring in April will begin in 2013-14. That one. In terms of redesigning educator preparation and program approval, I want to talk about these separately. Our leadership preparation programs, as you know, we're existing under conditional approval, and we have requested that they submit an interim report. This report requested specific information. We're very interested in how they're assessing their candidates and how they are tracking the placement and retention of their candidates after they've completed the programs, in addition to asking them about significant changes they've made since their programs were initially proposed. We will get those reports back on November 5th. We are going to analyze those reports and give feedback to the preparation programs in early December. Based on our analysis of those reports, we're going to conduct pilot site visits. Again, this is a place where we want to get this work right. We don't want to just go collect a whole bunch of documents and be a monitoring organization. We want to make sure that site visits are both useful for the programs and their development and truly evaluative in their process. And so we want to make sure we get that right. And so we'll pilot that process in the spring and summer. And then we anticipate having all the leadership programs fully reviewed by the spring of 2014. Teacher preparation is a different game because we are already in the middle of our regular cycle of review of teacher preparation programs. And so this is going to be a shift that will be a little bit more challenging. We also have a lot more programs. As you might know, right now we are in a 7-year cycle, so every 7 years a program gets reviewed. We are definitely going to reconsider whether that kind of cycle is what works. We're thinking that we would like to reconsider what triggers a review. And as such, we need evaluations. We think annual evaluations, using our teacher report card as a part of that, production of candidates and their placement, and how those candidates are performing in the field. So all of those sorts of things are going to go into our new review of teacher preparation programs.
And the timeline for that, Amy?
We will bring you the proposal for that in April for what that's going to look like. And included in that proposal will be the timeline for implementing. Wait.
What's leadership preparation?
Leadership preparation, our principal preparation programs.
And are you looking at the curriculum and what they are to need to be learning different than what they have learned in the past?
So I'm going to I want to make sure that Paul jumps in if he wants to on this. So they are working on revising TILS, the licensure standards for our principals, and those will be a component of the review process in terms of how we want to do less looking at specifically what courses are you teaching, that sort of thing, but more how are you ensuring that your candidates, when they complete the program, are meeting our expectations in terms of standards and competencies we expect our leaders to bring into their roles.
So, as an example, when they exit a leadership program, would they have some level of competency in doing a teacher evaluation?
I think that as long as that's a part of the TILS, if TILS say that that's what a leader does, then we would be asking them to demonstrate to us.
Well, what if TILS is silent that Tennessee requires them to do it?
Well, that's something that we'll have to consider as we're putting all of this together, and that will we will have a review process that says what do these protocols include and what are the things that we're looking at, and we're going to give you and other stakeholders an opportunity to raise concerns like that, that if there are significant components that need to be there that aren't reflected, then we'll have a chance to add those. We don't have those defined right now, and that's the part of our development process that we're engaging in. And on my next slide, when I talk about licensure processes, we have a few key planning sessions, work sessions that are coming up that are going to help us define more of these things. So I don't have a lot of concrete answers for you right now. Nothing is out, and everything's on the table in terms of what it's going to look like. But we haven't done, for leadership preparation, we haven't been doing this, so we don't know what it looks like yet.
Amy, are you planning on bringing the revised TILs back to this board for an amendment into the policy?
Paul is going to talk about this in his presentation and give you some really good information about that, and I won't attempt to do that. Licensing architecture. As you know, we also want to streamline and make our licensing process a lot more efficient. I may have said this last time, and I'll say it again. It's my drumbeat lately. My Office of Teacher Licensing got over 15,000 applications this summer, and we can't possibly, with the manpower we have right now, process all of those. We don't think the answer is that we need more people. We think the answer is that we need a more streamlined licensing architecture, and not just because of the number, but because it's not necessarily an efficient process that actually serves the students of Tennessee. It doesn't help us get more effective educators necessarily, and so we want to redesign our licensing system to make sure that we're tight on quality and effectiveness, and that licenses reflect real differences in the work teachers are doing and or the expectations that we have for them. I mentioned 2 meetings that we have scheduled that are going to begin to help us get much more concrete. I know you're eager to hear more concrete plans, both about program approval and the design of licensing. We have a meeting in late October where we are bringing in a group of national experts to just help us think innovatively about this and say, you know, we don't need to be thinking about what other states have done in the past or what we've done in the past. Let's come up with new ideas and solutions and take best practices and push them even further and come up with some real solutions for our teachers and leaders. So after that session, we also have an internal working session that we have planned in early November, and both of those we think are going to produce the template that will help us move forward, and in January we expect to bring you another update and hopefully have a few more specifics for you. Any other questions on that? And if not, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Questions? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, just to continue this conversation, I think what's interesting, like we heard from Emily this morning about Common Core and instructional shifts, we're seeing significant leadership shifts happening across Tennessee. And so 10 Lead is our leadership initiative to try to capture and marshal a lot of those resources and to do that in a really systematic way. And that's what we want to talk about and then get into the TILS revision as well. Because we are talking about systemic change at the school level that, if you think about it, even from 2008, what has changed with Common Core implementation, ACT and NAEP standards and testing becoming much stronger and more prominent, the team evaluation, a lot of the evaluation models, all of those are causing what we're calling these key shifts in school leadership. And I wanted to point out just 3 out of these 5 in particular that I find really interesting that we are trying to push in a good way all of the leaders in Tennessee towards. Because if we know that instructional practices and teaching practices have the most significant impact on student achievement, it's leadership that has the second most important impact on student achievement. And what's interesting about especially bullets 1, 2, and 5 are how do we, for example, on bullet 1, develop teacher leaders? How do we really focus, retain, recruit, and retain those teachers and make them teacher leaders in our buildings? And how do we teach principals how to do that? That's a very different model than what they've been used to. That second bullet, I know that the feedback from year 1 on teachers was one of the most significant pieces of feedback said, don't just tell me I'm a 2 on the evaluation, but actually coach me on how to get better. And even our level 5 teachers said that, right? They said, coach me on how to get better. What are those strategies? And so these are handouts we have for you as well on the shifts. But I find that we're trying to be really systematic about how do we move our leaders towards those areas on the right-hand side. And finally, I would say that 5th bullet is interesting because now that teachers are getting more regular feedback on evaluation, it also causes a shift for principals to say, if I have 4 teachers now that really need help with academic feedback and questioning, that is very different than maybe my 10 other teachers that need help on planning and on lesson plans and on Common Core implementation. So that's a significant shift that they need to recognize, and we need to help bring forward as we go forward. And so we're trying to be very intentional about these are the leadership behaviors we're hoping to see across the state in our school leaders as well. And I think it's not to say we're ignoring on the left-hand side, because we know we still have to have building managers, we still have to have the facilities run, we still have to focus on individual planning, there still has to be a focus on hiring, but it's how do we shift in a way that's systematic. So these are just some of the quick levers that we are focusing on from the state for capturing more partners and utilizing more partners across the state. That's also for our 10 lead grants that we're going to be rolling out on leadership. And that's going to actually ask LEAs to think and partner with either nonprofits or institutions of higher ed for either development or replication of innovative and best practices. We have our Tassel Academies right now that are up and running, and we'll talk about those more in connection with TILS. Peer coaches, as Emily mentioned, with Common Core, it's been a very effective practice to say how do we peer coach teachers, principals, and we want to take that even to the supervisor level and director of schools level too on coaches. And then finally, training resources that are going to go through the core offices as well. So that's just kind of a highlight of some of the levers, the key levers we're going to be talking about. This does lead us to TILS, because as we know, this is the foundation. This is the framework, and this is the leadership standards that are the basis in the state. And so how do we think more carefully and incorporate some of those leadership shifts into? What's been interesting is my colleague Carla Cushman and I have been training in the Tassel cohorts over the last 8 weeks, over 800 beginning principals, assistant principals, and supervisors in those cohorts. And we've put, and this is, I'm going to pass those around for the draft. This is an updated draft of the TILs that we've put in front of all of them, as well as these other groups that you can see from August to October. And really interesting feedback to get from those groups, especially principals, supervisors, about how do we capture some of those shifts now into a revised TILs to talk about shared leadership, to talk about hiring practices. And it's an interesting anecdote. It's been eye-opening for me. I was a high school principal the last 6 years before I came to the state this summer here in Metro at Hume-Fogg High School. And I had almost total hiring power in terms of who I could go after, who I could, I didn't have power about the number of staff, but I had power about how I wanted to go and recruit, and how I wanted to retain, and how I wanted to attract. Finding out very quickly across the state, depending on the LEA and the district, that power does not always rest, as we know, with the principal. And so one of the challenges, you'll see reflected in the TILs, is how do we put in the standards that we want principals to have more power, and we want that power to be granted, and at the same time recognize and not to evaluate them if they don't have that power, right, about hiring practices. So that's why it's been really helpful to get feedback from everybody, from THEC to SCORE to the Principal Study Council. We're going to meet next week with the Beginning Superintendent's Academy and put this draft in front of them as well. In November, we want to put this out online so that all principals, supervisors, directors, school board members, and the reps from, as Amy mentioned, the 19 leadership prep programs have an opportunity to give feedback on the revision for the draft of TILs. And then finally in December, the deans from all of the prep programs are going to be at that THEC-sponsored event that we want to put out in front. So trying to marry what these shifts represent, and then also thinking really carefully about how do we get a set of leadership standards that are strong and that reflect what we want principals to do, with those behaviors. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of where we are on the TILs revision.
Paul, are you getting any pushback from any of those groups concerning the power that the principal would have, the hiring authority?
Yes and no. I think it's a good question to see, and it's complicated, as we know. There are 136 districts. You have a lot of scenarios about principals and whether they have power maybe to interview but not to recruit, or maybe they have the full power, right? And so it really ranges depending on there. But I think if we go back to, there's principals who are really hungry and they know that they have to develop their teachers more thoughtfully, and it's more important because of evaluation and accountability that they are hungry for that power, to do that. So again, just a quick overview of the timeline. We're going with a goal to bring this for you to the board in January. We also have in the revision the language from the professional learning standards that were adopted by the state board last year, and also the teacher leader standards, the national teacher leader standards as well. This was just a more specific breakdown of our first draft. We had this many in round one that we're looking at the first draft of the revised TILs, and then we captured all that feedback, put it into a round two, and that's why you now have a draft that's elegantly named 2.5. That's there as well. So that's just to give you a highlight. And part of what we used was from ETS, and Amy certainly knows these pretty well, with the standards or criteria for well-written standards. And we tried to really make this explicit with the groups that were getting access to the revision, right? How explicit are these standards? How much context do they provide? How measurable are they? It was interesting to see a lot of folks, especially assistant principals and principals, say, you got to cut out the fuzzy language, right? We got to cut out words like high energy or things that are harder to measure. And so they wanted real specific language on the feedback as well. So just some pieces there about measurable, essential, and then making it clear, trying to be very clear on that.
It was said earlier that this could be really a sea change, but I suspect this really is a lot different than the current curriculum of preparation for principals.
On some of those shifts or the...
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you asked that question earlier, and I would bet of those 19 prep programs, there's a range of focus, right? On that.
I'd say there's quite a range.
What's that?
Yeah. This has nothing to do with anything we're talking about, so I like to do it. There, in my mind, that there ought to be, in addition to this, if you look in a school system, there's a lot that's not on the curriculum side. There's a lot that drives a lot of management of costs that are in capital projects, food, transportation, all of finance, maybe parts of HR. 50 years ago, the chief physician of the hospital would be the administrator of the hospital. There really needs to be an MBA program for that side of the house, an MBA in public education that understands all the needs, but also has a lot of business skills to manage tens of millions of dollars in capital projects and just all the business side. Mm-hmm. You don't need to train a lot of folks.
It's interesting that there's some schools and districts that are exploring that. In other words, taking the typical assistant principal, making them kind of the CEO, building manager, and then saying, how do we develop aspiring principals is through other pathways, teacher leaders, instructional coaches, but we're designating kind of this building CEO, as you will, as a way of really running that side of it and less on the instructional side.
That's going to be a whole lot more skills, different skills. It really is the same as taking out the chief of surgery as running a major hospital and putting someone else on that side. Not the superintendent, not the principal, but someone who's going to be running finance probably ought to have a whole lot of business.
Right. That's some of the thinking, especially with the management issue of that. Good. So that's just to wrap up. I'm going to turn it back to Sarah now for some team updates. And And if there are questions at the end, either on leadership or on this, or are there questions now on the timeline and the feedback? So.
Question?
Yeah, I would just add to Mike's point, I mean, it really is kind of this shared model of leadership. I think is so important for that reason. I mean, it's not that those things go away when you start focusing principals more fully on the instructional leadership and the talent management pieces, but it really is about how do you build a team, a leadership team that makes sure that all those bases are covered in clear and appropriate ways so that the role designations are clear. And if the principal is to be the instructional leader, then that's what that role really is designed to do. But then figuring out how you cover those other bases around the management, I think is still, you know, it's something that we're trying to work with principals to figure out. And it's going to look different across contexts, obviously, depending on the scale and the scope of the school or the district. But
and then try to have it reflected in the standards, too.
And the only other thing I would say, too, on the standards, I mean, the standards are the foundation, as Paul said, for a lot of the work that we're doing around program approval, but also principal evaluation. But they're not the same as the principal evaluation rubric. I mean, they're going to serve as a basis for what would be reflected in principal evaluation. But sometimes I think those get conflated.
Yeah.
Okay, if we're still good on time, I would like to give you just a brief update on evaluation implementation since we're almost halfway through year 2. We've been working hard to communicate the changes, again, in policy that were passed over the summer. We've done a series of regional meetings, the roadshow, as we were calling it, through the core centers, but drawing on both the core directors as well as our new team coaches that we'll tell you about here in just a minute, to make sure that the leadership teams around evaluation, each district has kind of put together what we're calling their leadership team around evaluation, have come together to meet, to learn about these changes, to ask questions about implementation of these changes. So that was happening over the course of the last month and a half. We've continued with a weekly kind of e-newsletter. We've updated the format of that and are using Constant Contact now so that it's a little bit more user-friendly. We're able to post those online once they go out to the leadership teams to keep folks in the know about things that are coming out throughout the year. We've also updated the team website and, again, tried to make sure that the right documents, the right resources are easily accessible through that website. We've revised the training documents, again, per the policy changes to make sure that folks have the right information at their disposal. Part of that has been sharing additional implementation tools, both some that we've developed and NIET has developed, and districts, as things kind of pop up and look like good practices across districts, we're able to share those more broadly through these weekly e-newsletters and through the website. There we go. In terms of targeted support, this is one of the new work streams this year, again, based on year 1 data. We were able to look at our scores and think about kind of how to target support more intentionally based on year 1. And what that meant was that we identified 72 schools who had the highest rate of observation to individual teacher effect scores where they were most misaligned. Now we know, you don't expect to see a perfect alignment. That's not necessarily the goal. There's plenty of reasons why the growth score that a teacher would receive and the observation score that he or she would receive would be different. But it did give us a place to look in terms of where there were patterns of misalignment, being able to go in and target support, to do co-observations, to provide additional training or guidance where teachers were receiving really mixed messages. It's a problem where a teacher is being told, on the one hand from a principal that they're a 5 on instruction, and then the growth score indicates that they're below expectation in terms of how they're moving their students. So trying to address those disconnects was the intent of kind of targeting these schools. To do that, we worked with NIET to hire 5 team coaches. These are all Tennessee practitioners who went through an application process, were hired by NIET to provide regional support in a little bit more systematic way than we did last year. And again, we're not shooting blind this year. We know kind of where to target their time and their resources. And so they're being deployed through the Centers of Regional Excellence. They actually report to the core directors, so they're part of a team. They're in the core offices. They also have weekly calls with our team, but they are working regionally, particularly with this portfolio of schools. And as they're working, their first charge was really to identify the underlying cause of misalignment. And again, like I mentioned, there's often some legitimate and understandable reasons why the scores might not be aligned. And so the first real charge to them was to unpack the data in each instance and determine, kind of what was going on in that individual school and what support would be most beneficial, what kind of level of support would be needed, and then to build a plan to support those schools in that work. Okay, and then another thing that is more widespread, not just the schools that we're targeting in terms of misalignment, but a new expectation this year is what we're calling a coaching conversation. And this is, again, based on data from last year, but we put out a lot of guidance and helped people to begin the year with a coaching conversation for those teachers who received a 1 on their growth score last year. We know that's really where principals and team coaches need to be focused. And so we did kind of some mock simulated conversations. We put some videos out to help people kind of have a sense of how to begin that conversation. That's a hard conversation to have, and particularly for principals who may not have been giving hard feedback in the past, to go in and tell a teacher who you've been telling for years that they've been doing a good job that, actually there's a reason to be concerned here and we need to take this on together. Even just how to begin that conversation, we thought it was important to help show people what that looked like. So Paul and Carla did some great acting, and Commissioner did an intro as well, and that's been, I think, a helpful tool. We also were able to use the LEAD conference as another chance to get in front of principals and superintendents to model and talk about these post-conferences, how to have these difficult conversations at the school level around evaluation. And those sessions were well attended, and hopefully another chance to really help people advance their skill in that work. Last thing I wanted to highlight for you is the data system. We were not completely satisfied with the system that was developed last year in terms of functionality, and just the cost model moving forward was problematic for a number of reasons. So we've retacked, and we are partnering now through NIET as well to use their system that's called CODE. It's been used in Knox County for a while, so I think we've made our friends over there happy. But it's the same system, actually, the same platform where the best practices portal lives, and that's the lesson bank and the certification tests. So we'll be able to use this data system, and it's in process right now, migrating both the data from last year into this system, getting people uploaded, so they should be able to enter scores starting here in the next few weeks. But what that will do as well is this year, when people are entering their scores, it will point them directly to the resources that are in the best practice portal. So if you put in a teacher's score, and as a teacher you go in and see where your area of reinforcement and refinement are, you can then be directly linked to those resources that are available to kind of address those areas of concern. So hopefully that will be a good way to kind of marry those resources. We'd had this portal last year, but I think it was probably pretty underutilized. This will help to drive people to those resources more directly. And it also has a lot better reporting functionality. That was another frustration with the system last year, is that we were pretty limited in the kinds of reports that we could run, that districts could run, that school leaders could run. So that will improve as well with this new system. And that's all I have. We're happy to take more questions. Contact information as well for the folks you heard from. Luke Colomos, who I brought with me too, if there's questions on TEAM. He's managing a lot of the day-to-day implementation of TEAM this year. So he's a good one to contact if you have TEAM-specific questions. Happy to.
Can you just update us, Sarah, on where we stand with the non-tested subjects in the evaluation?
Absolutely. So this year, as you know, you've passed policy around kind of the early grades and the SAT-10, so that is being used in many districts across the state this year for grades 1, 2, and 3. We also have a handful of districts that are using the Fine Arts peer-reviewed portfolio model. That was the other individual growth measure that you approved at your summer meeting. We have other teams that are continuing to work on those other areas, and there's some hope that we can use that same portfolio model for some of the areas like pre-K. But this work remains challenging, and we have set a pretty high bar for ourselves in terms of what we will recommend to you for approval. I think what we've seen in a lot of states is that they're rushing to approve measures that may or may not really reflect a spectrum of performance at the teacher level, and so we want to be cautious about that. And it's one of the reasons we want to also include in our legislative proposal some thought around areas where we may not be able to get a measure developed, looking at the percentage that would comprise that school level score, so that it's potentially more appropriate in terms of the percentage weight if in fact it's not going to be an individual growth measure for a given educator group.
Sarah, if you go back some.
Tell me when.
No, there. When you're talking to the principals about how how you're helping them get from the disconnect of either giving a 4 or 1. What happens to their senior reports in all of this?
Meaning their manager?
Someone is supposed to be evaluating that principal, and that evaluation should have, you kind of suck on these evaluations. We need to improve on that. And I suspect that that's been sort of.
Yeah, no, you always have a way of cutting right to the issue, Mike. I mean, that is a huge focus for us this year. You know, last year we spent a lot of our time and energy on getting teacher evaluation right. We did, less on principal evaluation. We rolled it out at the same time. It was based on TILs. People are familiar with TILs. We included the quality of teacher evaluation as a component, but the training around it was pretty surface level. And so we really want to think hard towards making that a more meaningful piece of this, because we know that that's going to have a lot to do with the quality of implementation at the school level. Is that if we can get, Paul mentioned the supervisors, they actually play a really important role in this in terms of the principal evaluation. So really making sure that we have both tight tools and training on the principal evaluation moving into next spring and summer on the principal evaluation, I think is going to be really important in kind of moving us to the next level and helping to close that alignment gap.
They're liable to get more realistic when they realize their future and whether they're going to be in that school or not next year.
Right. And that really requires getting to the directors of school and the supervisors who are making those decisions about principal hiring, principal placement.
Getting some good feedback from teachers on the changes that we made in the evaluation system. We got some feedback from those some that participated in some of the listening sessions, school listening sessions, others that we did. And they can't believe we actually heard it and made some changes.
Hopefully that brought us some goodwill, but yes, you're right. I'm glad to hear that you've been getting good feedback as well.
And the world that comes to an end at the end of the year.
Yeah. And at this time last year, the world was coming.
Yeah, it's amazing the difference a year makes.
Yeah, oh yeah. There were some of those changes that will require legislative action. Are we gearing up for that and getting in front of the legislature?
We are. Can speak to some of that if you'd like, but Kathleen mentioned the special education change. The weighting, again, is something that we want to look really carefully at, especially when it applies to non-tested areas, and the weighting for school-wide scores. Yep.
One other question, in terms of the teacher preparation programs and the leader preparation programs, is anything we're doing going to reduce the number of those programs out there? I guess.
Well, the program approval.
I believe that we can support all of them that are out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the program approval is we tighten up our requirements and make those more output driven and really reflect back in a meaningful way the quality of candidates once they're in the classroom or at the school level. That will start to change the field in terms of who's producing candidates.
We license so many more leaders than ever even contemplated becoming school leaders, and we have to figure out how to take that on. I mean, we have I don't even know how many thousands of licensed school leaders across the state.
You aren't practicing.
Roughly about 10,000 that have that, and only about 3,000 that are actually practicing as a leader. So, yeah.
When we were going work developing the TILs, the number was about 1,400 per year finishing a master's degree today.
And that gets at some of the salary structures and why people get the degree versus why we might want them to get the degree. Certification.
Okay, other questions for Sarah? Okay, very good. Good report, good work. We appreciate it. Why don't we take a quick break here before we head to the next subject? Let's take it about 10 minutes. Alabama, that's
had seen the email that went out like and I figured that's what was going on.
And they delay that a little. We want to make sure
Have anything, Aaron, this year, she developed this thing.
I'm on the elementary team. Yeah. And the lady that I sent the email to was a Miss Quinn. Yes, and I'm excited about this. I just finished up at UTC with Dr. Metzko, and I understand she's really proud of her, so I hope that I'm not going to get kicked out now with what I've just done.
Strong programs, we have some that are not as strong, and so it's just part of the highlight.
I was sitting there going, oh no, I just
Your degree is still not valid.
$50,000 for nothing. Okay, glad to hear that.
Yeah, we'll look forward to having you.
Okay, good.
Talking about it.
That's the worst of all combinations. Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Knowing that long ago?
And then we can do me and my we take lunch. We're doing it first floor. We're going to invite, I think, right? The lobby. Yeah. And one of those two. You'll sell it. And then we can either kind of there and go talk somewhere or eat and talk or whatever. In the afternoon. Okay. Yeah. That's like building a house. Well, thank you. This is
They don't have to put one in.
She's a little bit knocking off the rubber.
Yeah, that's what, that's happened back. That started. Whatever it goes for, it's not wrong. Yes, that's what it's somebody take out and say, board of video kids.
Let's reconvene here.
All board members, they should have done, I have school. Would you go on the agenda then? Yeah. Really don't have a legal discussion. Okay.
Okay. Appreciate everybody being back. The next item on the agenda really is to talk about the master plan and particularly the targets, measures that we've got set up in the master plan. And we've been kind of struggling with this for a number of meetings here, and we've got it on the agenda for tomorrow's meeting for final approval. And after we talk about it, we can talk some more about this, but my recommendation is going to be that we hold off on this until January and do some more thinking and so forth, analysis on some of these numbers that we've got here to make sure we've got the right numbers. There is not a pressing need to approve this at this meeting, so I think it's okay to wait till January. We will need to take some action in January that our old master plan is expiring, and we need to get this ready for the legislative session, for the coming legislative session. So what I'm recommend is that we kind of work off this sheet here. I think everybody got a copy of this. If we don't, we've got some more of them. And talk through these numbers. I think we've got the right people here to talk about the numbers. I guess several concerns that I have on these numbers that I want to make sure we address here is particularly the percent proficient, the gap that shows up between NAEP and TCAP. I understand a lot about why that gap is showing up, but from a just impression standpoint or from appearance standpoint, we're not closing that gap. And a part of our objectives in doing a lot of what we've done with education reform is to close the gap between our state tests and NAEP tests, so forth, and that's just not happening. So with that, I guess Aaron or Gary or others who are going to be talking about this, how we got these numbers and so forth, if we could just kind of work through each one of these and talk about how we got to the numbers that are there and whether they're the right numbers we want to have for targets going forward.
Let me kind of kick it off, Aaron, and then we can work through it. In our discussion, Philly and I had asked Aaron to put together, or Stephen asked Aaron to put together another sheet that you have in front of you that has the actual scores for 2010 and 2011 where they were available, so to see what we've done since that baseline to show the progress we're making at that point, and then show the targets and the interim and the target for 2019, 2020. And Aaron's done this, and I think she's done a good job of putting this together for us. So Aaron, you want to walk it through? You want to kind of tag team on this?
Sure. And so essentially what we did was just to fill in the data where we had it available on the TCAP tests in particular, also on the NAEP tests, and of course the last NAEP administration. We are doing the NAEP administration this year, so we should have probably around this time next year data back on NAEP. One thing around NAEP, just to give you all a little bit more information on what's going on with NAEP for this year. So we anticipate a few things that will happen. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the department is to focus the schools that have been chosen as NAEP sites more on taking the NAEP test seriously. So the NAEP test is a test that is sampled across different schools and districts in the state, and then there are specific students and classrooms that are sampled on the different portions of the NAEP test. And so traditionally, we've done some outreach on NAEP. We've not done a lot of focused outreach on NAEP, so we're moving that more forward this year to try and focus people on NAEP for a couple of different reasons. One is that we know that the distance between where we are, so the progress that we've made over the last couple of years on our state tests has been great. But if we don't see that same kind of progress or some kind of progress on the NAEP tests, then that'll call into question some of the things we know about what we've sort of seen in terms of growth on our state tests. And so we want people to be sure to be focused on the fact that the progress that we'd like to see us make on NAEP is going to be important, not only for what we've done in the state, but then also for the potential of federal funding, for the potential of some other issues that we need to be focused on. As well, the NAEP test is actually more similar in terms of construction to the PARCC tests than are our current tests that we have in place. So all the things Emily was talking about before and the items that you looked at in terms of constructive response and that type of thing. And also the NAEP tests are more similar to the constructive response assessments that we're piloting that have to do, again, with those Common Core related items. So we're really trying to bring that message more to the districts and schools that are going to be taking NAEP this year. And we expect that that should have some effect as well on how seriously people take NAEP and hopefully therefore translate into some work there on scores. So that's just a couple of things around NAEP.
Is NAEP administered in the fall or the spring?
The administration window runs between January and March, and it's for different schools. It'll happen at different points in time. They submit a date to the NAEP assessment board, then NAEP tells them when that can occur. Yes?
Did we not change the TCAP assessment to closer align with NAEP?
Yeah, so we did. So one of the things when we changed standards and assessments, so when we changed the assessments and then we looked at the standards and reset our cut scores, part of that was about the relationship between where we were at that time and the NAEP tests. So they were very far out of alignment, right? We are now in a place where things are in much closer alignment than they had been at that point in time. And really, we should expect to see, we would hope to see gains on the NAEP test based on what we've seen in terms of the gains on our state tests. But again, the state tests are a different type of test. It's a test that is taken every year by all students. There are lots of sort of administrative differences between the TCAP and the NAEP tests. And as we look around the country at, most states find that there is a good bit of distance between where their state test proficiency levels are and where the NAEP proficiency levels are. I've highlighted a couple of the reasons why we think that occurs. And so in part, that's why we looked at, so one of the things we looked at for the revised NAEP goals from the perspective of first to the top. So we looked at that interim target 2014-15. So all the targets you see there are very close to those targets that we put in for our waiver as well as the first to the top targets. So we revised those slightly based on some revised numbers from last year. None of them are more different than a percentage point than what you all have here. On the first to the top goals related to NAEP, what was done was actually to look around at other states that had experienced significant gains on NAEP and see how much much gain they were able to get between one administration and the next, so that we could set targets from the first to the top perspective that were, we think, realistic about what we might be able to experience if we were to be the fastest improving state in the nation on NAEP, which is the goal. So that's why you see the revised targets there.
Who's doing the best job out there? Who are our peer cities?
Well, we looked into it. It really varied from grades and subjects and from year to year. So we actually took percentage gains from two different assessments, from 07 to 09 and then 09 to 11, because you would see states who went forward 16 percentage points in one year, and in the next administration they went backwards 4 percentage points. So there's no one who is consistently, in terms of growth, really moving around all years, all students. Some of the states that we used as our pace setters were Maryland had averaged 3.5% growth from one administration to the next. Rhode Island had 4.5%. Connecticut and Kentucky had 4%, and then DC had 4.5%. So that's where we got our targets, matching that rate of growth from one administration to the next.
Kentucky's probably cheap.
Aaron, maybe start at the TCAP, for instance, third grade reading. How did we arrive at the 75% for the 19, 20, and so forth? Just the methodology that will apply to the other TCAP.
Yeah, I'm going to be drawing a bit on experience and a bit on what I know from what happened, because I was around, but maybe not as closely involved with how this was done. So and David and Gary might be able to chime in here if I misstate anything, but essentially a group of staff from the department, from the state board, and I think we had a couple of people from school districts engaged at some point as well, looked at where are we right now in terms of proficiency levels. So this was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Where were we at that point? So right after we had reset our assessment, cut scores, right after we had redone standards, where were we? Where did we want to be in sort of an ideal situation, but where also do we think we sort of realistically might be able to get? And that's how we arrived originally at those 14, 15 targets, which were first used for the College and Career Ready Policy Institute, that then you all adopted as state board goals, that then were written into the Race to the Top application as the Race to the Top goals. So in an attempt to actually align all of these things across the various conversations that we're having. So this was about trying to set goals, I think, that were, getting towards college and career readiness, but also about trying to have things that seemed more realistic. So that's how the third grade reading, the fourth grade reading on NAEP, et cetera, were done at that time. So then when we went back through and revised the first of the top goals around NAEP, the procedure that Megan just highlighted, that's how that occurred. And I think, in part towards the purpose of wanting to have, really as part of the waiver process, as part of the first to the top process, what we want to have is ambitious but achievable goals. And that's really the goal. And so each goal is separate too. So each goal is separate based on where you started. So you'll see 75% proficiency on third grade reading TCAP, but on fourth grade math NAEP, because it started lower, you see a lower target in 1920. So that's really why the targets are different when you get to that 14, 15, and 19, 20. And so the 19, 20 is sort of the continuation of, where would you think you could be in essentially 10 years. And the one thing I would say about the 1920 goals is that at this point, these really will become irrelevant, because after 14, 15, we're going to be
TCAP.
TCAP,
not
right?
the NAEP.
Not the NAEP, correct, but the TCAP will go away. We would expect to see that our performance levels on PARCC would probably be even more closely associated with our performance levels on NAEP than the TCAP currently is.
But I haven't looked at it, but we should be seeing as like third grade math accelerates, that would automatically create an acceleration in fourth grade math.
So that would be true if you're looking at third grade TCAP and fourth grade TCAP. I think we would expect to see that when you're looking at third grade TCAP and fourth grade NAEP. I think that we would hope to see that same acceleration.
But when we're trying to get to the end game,
right?
Even though all of these on the baseline are lower than we would want them to be,
right?
As each of the previous grades succeed and grow, that's going to create an automatic growth in the succeeding grade.
Yeah, we should expect to see that kind of, especially again on the state tests. I think with NAEP we'll have to see how we do. But we would expect to see that same kind of progress on the state tests.
Well, it's not projected that way. I think it'll happen. She mastered third grade.
When you get to Explore Plan ACT, what we're doing there is looking at the percentage of students that are meeting the college and career ready benchmarks as established by ACT. So ACT has, as you know, various scores that they associate with the particular tests that agree with what they call their college and career ready standard. And essentially that is, I believe it's related to the likelihood that a student is able to perform at a certain level when they're in college. And so you can see where on Explore Plan and ACT, we aren't seeing the kind of growth that we would need to be able to hit the targets as they're currently set. Those are very difficult tests to find movement on, but again, the hope would be that as we see improvement and the kind of improvement that we've seen on TCAP tests over the last couple of years, you'd start to see more improvement within Explore Plan and ACT.
Aaron, I think the ACT numbers there, I think look real good. I think we can, tie to the things you mentioned there, the benchmark. Getting back to TCAP and Nate, how do we answer the question about the gap between Nate and TCAP, or it's likely to be there between Nate and Park also? When we get the question from the local reporter on, I thought we were, going to be truthful, and we've been using Nate as the truth out there about where we are, and yet we're still showing this big variance, big gap between our in-state TCAP in this case and Nate. How do we answer that?
I'll defer to Kevin in a minute. I think one of the things we'll want to see is how we do on this next NAEP assessment. And if we don't see the kind of progress that we might expect to see on this next NAEP assessment, then I think we have to take another look at our standards, and our cut scores for the TCAP tests. But again, we're moving to completely different tests in 2 years that are going to be nationally normed, for lack of a better way to describe it. So I think, what I would say is we did reset standards, we reset our assessments, and people have been able to make pretty good gains based on that. The relationship between that and NAEP, I think, is still left to know. I don't think you can necessarily judge the 2010-11 NAEP administration, given all the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years. I think we really have to see where we are next time.
Yeah, it is. Tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, but my suspicion is that the current TCAPs are much more like our previous exams than they are like ACT or NAEP. And that the Common Core Park exam would be much more like ACT and much more like NAEP with
absolutely
the type of responses. My suspicion is it'll probably be another NAEP administration, or maybe two, before we have students with enough experience in Common Core to really start to move that bar.
That's what I was going to say. I think we've got there are two questions. One is TCAP compared to NAEP, and the other is Park compared to NAEP. In the future, when you get to Park compared to NAEP, NAEP will be good to continue to look at as an additional benchmark. But we're going to, every single year, be able to look at ourselves on the same test against 20-some other states. And we're going to be able to look at that, unlike NAEP, at a district-by-district level. And so one of the things that I think is exciting, but also scary, is a school that's performing really well right now in TCAP. Once we get into Park, they're going to be able to know, if this school was located in Massachusetts, how would we do? If this school was located in New Jersey, how would we do? Yes, we're top quartile in Tennessee. Are we top quartile of all the states? Are we top 50% of all the states? So I think that will be, and I'm less worried about whether the cut score for Park aligns closely with the cut score for NAEP, because I think we'll get the kind of robust information that we want in terms of national norming. And in terms of now, the reason we set the goal at the department that we wanted to be the fastest improving state in the country by 2015 is we do think it's going to take a little bit of time as we go into Common Core, as people get more familiar with higher standards. So I don't want to set the expectation that we're going to have rapid fire growth on NAEP next year. I would be pleasantly surprised if that was the case. I would expect to see some positive movement on NAEP next year, but I certainly am not anticipating that we're going to come back and see massive growth. And I think for me, whether it's NAEP, whether it's ACT, or ultimately whether it's Park, if our goal is to move the fastest of any state in improvement, that's a good thing for us to target ourselves with. And as Megan said, on NAEP, historically, the fastest growth means something in the range of sort of 4% improvement from one administration to the next.
You know, one of these days, we need to take a real hard look at any resource deficiencies that we have, that whether we're talking about NAEP or TCAP, that is holding us back from making, being able to deliver education at a level that the attainment's going to meet, that it's going to follow. And if we're, this is an example, Knox County has one school that has Wi-Fi in it, other than, like, some of them have it in the library. So, to really get on the internet, you're going to go to McDonald's. And to think in the year 2012 that a school district that is fairly well thought of, and we know a lot of districts that are around there that do not have the resource around us, and I'm sure throughout, we're going to have to look at resource availability. We've got, I think we've got the standards, we've got the measurements and the assessments. We really need to do an assessment of resources as to whether we've got, we're attracting the right faculty, we're retaining the right faculty, and we've got the right stuff. And until we do that, we may be just pushing against something that we don't have the infrastructure to deliver.
Mr. Chairman, to address your question about how do you explain that gap between to the public between the TCAP and the NAEP, some information that might be good to keep in mind is that there's a bit of a fundamental difference between the purpose of these two assessments. The NAEP assessment is more of a research tool that strives to advance instruction and achievement, so it's setting a higher bar for students to achieve, whereas our state assessments and the PARCC assessments are designed to be a truer measure of individualized student achievement. And so what that looks like in more plain language is NAEP questions tend to be more non-routine. They're more fresh and non-redundant. They have less banked items, so they make fresh, challenging questions that are designed to provoke thought that kids haven't routinely seen in textbooks or in preparation for practice, to really see if they have a deep proficiency, how will they respond then to these challenge items. Whereas our TCAPs, our state assessments, and the PARCC, its purpose is going to be to assess that this child has achieved at least a minimum proficiency of what they can do. So there's a separation in skills. So by nature, the way the tests are designed, that's the big difference. Now, with the PARCC assessment, those questions then are going to become more NAEP-like. You've heard that term before, NAEP-like. So what that means is more routine and giving multiple strategies for problem solving or engagement. So to give more variety. So the instruction then, as we change our instruction techniques to prepare for PARCC, will help us to prepare more for that NAEP thinking. And our TCAPs, even though we made substantial change in the rigor of the TCAPs from the prior standards with the diploma project, they still didn't have that same depth of direction that the NAEP-like questions have and the PARCC's going to have.
And again, we're starting to move more that way with our constructive response assessments, with our writing assessments in a low-stakes environment, so that we can get students more and more of that type of performance-based assessment than we currently have.
Which of these numbers have we used in commitments that we made to the feds, or any of these numbers? I know we noted the ones that race to the top for first school, but
so we, for the purposes of our waiver, we gave targets for 2014, 2015.
on NAEP?
On No, sir, on TCAP. So
TCAP
on
and
third grade reading and math, seventh grade reading and math, 3 through 8 reading and math, Algebra 1, English 2, and graduation
15.
rates going out to 14, 15, and even a few years beyond that. But the 14, 15 is really the primary goal for first to the top. And so the waiver goals and the first to the top goals are aligned at this point.
That's correct, except for NAEP. So the waiver goals that Aaron's talking about are for accountability purposes, and obviously NAEP is not included in accountability purposes. So we have that through the feds as a first to the top target, but it's not included in the waiver. But all of the other TCAP goals that are in accountability are the same as our first to the top TCAP goals.
Okay. I guess any other questions on the kind of the first page on this document down to the ACT, the core plan, so forth?
Yeah, Gary, are all of these working to a number of college, a percentage of college workforce ready? Do we have like a target number of Tennesseans that when they finish?
You look on the third page, percentage of graduates in non-developmental, non-remedial.
Yeah.
Those last two on the right are kind of what we're hoping for.
And on the data that is related to post-secondary, I just wasn't able to get this in here in time. THEC has done some of those calculations. They just don't have yet publicly available some of those things because they did those calculations slightly differently for the purposes of this data than they do for their public data. So as soon as we have those from them, which should be in the very near future, we'll get those.
Yeah, and these are basically, this is the reason I think it may be good to delay till January to approve this document so that we hopefully can get the numbers that are dealing with
and at that point we would also
high school education.
At that point, we'd also have the post-secondary numbers for this year.
Yeah.
So they actually don't report a number of the things for the most current year until well into the fall.
I think that's the only one that gets it, that it's hard to capture one from those who are not in the workforce.
Yeah.
What about the English 3 and do we have the baseline numbers for English? Do we have the numbers for English 3 and Algebra 2?
We do. I didn't put those on here because I was operating from the CCRPI indicators that y'all had adopted. We do actually have that data available. I'd be happy to get that to you all. We can get you whatever information you're looking for.
But we've got the English 3 baseline 11, 12 number.
We haven't officially looked at the interims of the 2020. We have the 11 first administration for English 3.
Yeah, good baseline.
And we established targets for 14, 15, and 19, 20 for English 3.
We have not yet. No, we have not.
That's something we'll have to collaborate on and get a group together to look at that and have that ready for the next meeting.
Okay. Okay, I think we're maybe down to the 11 and 12 there, which is what really Mike was talking about, I guess 11, 12, and 13. And these are the numbers that are, I guess, we're working with THEC on.
Yeah. I think these numbers are probably realistic, but if I was a Tennessee consumer, is rattled. I mean, less than half the people reading on grade level according to TCAP.
What was that, Mike? Which one are you looking at?
If you look at where we are now, third grade reading, and that's on TCAP, we got less than half of Tennessee reading on grade level.
We're getting better though, right?
Actually, well,
we're going to get better.
And really we get into we could be making great progress, but the trajectory puts us over into some biblical time frame that we don't want. We really need to figure out what we don't have that we need to increase this trajectory.
Okay, the other question, I guess, that I have is on 15, which is percentage of first-time postgraduate students completing degrees, 150% of the normal time. I guess my thought would be that that's really not a K-12 issue, that's a post-secondary issue. The others kind of interface, the other measures that go beyond, kind of relate to the product that we're producing out of K-12, but it seems like that 15 gets way over into is totally in TX area as opposed to K-12. Maybe I'm missing something.
So again, we're just operating from what had previously been set as the targets, but with indicator 13 and 14, those are actually required reporting indicators for Race to the Top. We have calculated those slightly differently now than they were previously calculated, because the way they were previously done was before Race to the Top Race to the Top has actually set the definitions for those particular targets differently than they had originally been calculated for this. So those end up looking slightly different from the baseline, or the original baseline, to what the revised First to the Top baseline would be. That's obviously your choice as to if you want to try and align with the First to the Top numbers, or if you wanted to try and stay with the numbers that as you all had set them.
You said it was a different benchmark?
Yeah, so for example, where you see...
Now you're talking about 13 and 14.
Yeah, right. Yes, I'm talking about 13, 14. So when I think when it was originally done on indicator 13, so I'll explain 13 first and then 14 second. The way that was done was actually just to take it was not done by matching student data. So it was actually done by taking the number of Tennessee public high school graduates and then looking at the number of first-time freshmen in Tennessee public institutions that were 19 and under. So it was really a more imprecise measure. You weren't actually looking at individual students. So when it was revised for First to the Top, what happened was actually to take individual students that graduated from in a particular year from a Tennessee public high school and look at and track where those students went. Did they show up in a Tennessee public or private institution for which we have data, which means any of the institutions that participate in the Hope Scholarship? Did those students show up within 16 months? Is that correct? So it's a slightly more precise measure. It's a slightly different measure. Then
are we paying attention to if they were there the following year?
Not for that original indicator, which is just post-secondary attendance. For the second indicator, which is 14, which is looking at...
Let me get straight now. Yep. So are we now, though, going under the revised 13?
So what I just presented for you all here is what your original indicator was, and then what the revised First to the Top indicator would look like if that were to be the indicator that you wanted to have here.
Okay, so it's an either or.
Correct.
It's a lower baseline.
Yeah, slightly lower baseline. And again, that's looking at actual student progression, not an estimate of student progression.
Now the indicator 14, the revised First to the Top,
is much higher, right? And so I'll explain exactly what those two things are. So again, the first indicator 14, the percentage of recent public high school graduates who enroll in Tennessee public institutions and successfully complete 24 credit hours within one academic year and return the following fall. So essentially what that means is I graduate from high school, I go on to college, I do a full 24 hours in my first year, and I come back the next year, right? That's the measurement that you all had established and looked at. And what I've given you here, and so we can get that data from THEC in terms of how they would calculate that and where we are with respect to that, but we just had not had time to do that yet. And then the second one, which is the percentage of recent public high school grads who enroll in Tennessee public institutions, again, successfully complete 24 credit hours, but do that within 2 academic years. And that's the race to the top definition for what they call college for completion. That's what they call it. But it's really a measure of how far you've gotten in that first 2 years of college, essentially. And so, again, just to give you all the option that is what we're using from the first to the top perspective, because that's what the federal government is requiring for us to report to them on the first to the top goals.
And how you're being measured there, right?
Correct.
So you're saying when we started this process, it was after we raised the standards, it was part of the CCSD hour.
Right, and we came up with something that other states hadn't thought about measuring really yet in that same way. And then once we got into the race to the top world, it actually became something the federal government wanted to start measuring people on. Not just for race to the top, I actually think that they're going to I would suspect they stick with this type of definition for college enrollment and college completion from the perspective of reporting from states.
So we're measuring something different.
Measuring something different, correct.
But my question is, so like, back when you were looking at K through 12 and you adjusted the goals for first to the top for 14, 15, so when
right,
you adjusted.
We did not do that here. We just wanted to give you the actual baseline.
Because, so now you have a baseline of 70%, but you have a target of 58%.
Yeah, and honestly, I should have taken those 2 targets out as we haven't actually.
So it makes you look like you're.
Yeah, I repeated it. If I thought about it, I would have taken it off.
Okay.
And I think it goes back to, okay, are we comfortable with what we're measuring?
Right.
You know, ultimately, and trying to figure out what the right balance is, right?
Yeah. And whatever measurements you all would like to have as the measurements you want to choose for the master plan, whether you stick with these or you go with something else or you revise some of them, then we'd need to work with you all to set interim and out targets for those things.
I think I would recommend it to the degree we can, to try to be consistent and not have 2 sets of standards.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think, I certainly agree with that, and I believe that the revised first to the top thing probably is a better measure anyway, so.
I think, you could sort of cut it any which way, but I think it is more likely to be a measure that the federal government will continue to use as they make judgments about what states are doing.
So you're.
I believe that, one of the things that I think is going to be a challenge in all these post K-12 measures is the data collection of getting the data that you need to really know where you are, and I think it may be a little bit easier to get that data.
This is going to be much easier actually come this spring when we have a functional P20 database where actually these reports will be standardized in there and can be pulled up at any given point in time. So we have not yet standardized these reports with THEC. They have their own reporting that they do for their commission, et cetera, and we just haven't standardized them so that they're things that are publicly reported at this point.
We have to report on these through first to the top on a public website. So each year we do run these for even the post-secondary, and they will be for this past year available in January in an online database that we can share at that time.
Okay. What about the 15? Any thoughts about whether we ought to have that as part of the K-12 master plan, or whether that's, I kind of think that's beyond our reach.
Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that we perhaps keep it on the table as a college and career readiness measure, as watch, but not part of the master plan. It'd be nice to know how we're doing down the road. It's far removed, and I think the master plan needs to talk about really have a close relationship with K-12.
Any other? That's kind of
You know, if I'm John Morgan, I'm going to be looking at those numbers and thinking, dang, I'm only going to get paid for those I graduate, not how many that enter. I want some pretty good students entering, so I got a high probability of them graduating. Has nothing to do with what we're doing here, other than the fact that Pretty points out he's got a father.
Okay. What questions do we need to ask that we haven't asked?
That is a great question. I'll spend some time thinking about that and get back to you. I really think that the big question is, we now have goals that we've set related at the department, related to Race to the Top, related to the waiver, and the question for me would be, to what extent do you want to align closely with both of those things? Does that mean that you want to include different measures that are not currently on here? I think that's really the big question, and we can spend some time with Gary and staff on that.
Really, we need to see these measures, but we need to hear an explanation of why every year they are what they are. Why they're flat, why they went down, why they went up so high. Some sort of indication as to what happened that resulted in each of those numbers. So we can talk through what needs to happen to encourage it to keep going good, or to figure out what to do different to get it going.
My hope and dream has been for many years that we can have a given set of measures that stay in place for more than 1 year, and we could do just what Mike said, is review them each year, talk about whether we achieved them or didn't achieve them, and if we didn't, why didn't we, and what we got to do to fix it to achieve them. And we've never really been able to, or we've never established that set of measures that we've stayed with for several years. We've had measures, we look at them and they change, and this kind of thing. But hopefully that's what this set of measures will be. I think I think we're talking about, with the measures we got there and the data we've got there, we got things that are stable enough, ACT and NAEP and the TCAP Park, hopefully that we can do that. That you can have those consistent measures that are out there that you can tell where you're making progress or aren't making progress.
Well, I'm not sure that it's been said, but we all need to understand with parks here, we'll have to revisit these projections. We'll have to recalibrate based on the TCAP. When the TCAP goes away, if the park comes in, it'll be a different set of results.
This is not really related to this, but besides the park consortium, there's another consortium that's developing an assessment. What's the status on that, and how will these two play against each other in terms of reporting to the nation?
Well, we're better than theirs, so
well, we think
that's
so
the most
too.
important. Yeah, the Smarter Balance Consortium is moving forward with their plans to administer their test, and they, like Park, will have 20-some states that come out with their annual proficiency levels. Whether the cut scores look alike between Park and Smarter Balance, I don't know. And one of the things I think that will be useful that NIC will do is provide, again, an assessment regularly. Everybody who's taking Park and everyone who's taking Smarter Balance.
What about their timing? Are they going to be ready to use that assessment next year as well?
14, 15.
14, 15.
Yeah.
And there's actually a group of people between both groups that is having some conversation about how you might do similar reporting structures and that kind of thing.
Okay, an answer, Aaron, basically to the question you asked earlier about aligning the measures here with aligning the measures at the department and so forth. I think that what we really tried to do with this document is essentially align the whole document right on top of what y'all have done with your strategic plan.
Yeah, and I think we can do a better job of presenting which things are sort of involved and which places we just, we'll spend some time together to connect on what exactly you all want and need to be able to report on regularly.
We'll review and see if there are areas that are not here that are in the work that you've been doing that ought to go into this.
And Mike, did to your question on reporting, I think we did at maybe 2 state board workshops ago present the results. Am I making this up? That we presented the results on TCAP grade level by grade level and talked through what were areas of strength and what were areas of stagnation, and then what the growth was and how that growth compared to the previous year.
Now, what I think would be more, the follow-up to that is in the why. We believe the reason this happened is, and how we move this will be by doing.
Yeah.
And I'm, talking about resources is just sort of like an ugly thing for anybody to talk about. But the truth of the matter is, I'm going to do it because I think it's just the suspension of disbelief that we're not going to have more resources to move this needle further and quicker. But I'm sure there's other things as well, and that's the part we need to really be aware of in order for us to do what we need to be doing for you.
We're going to change Mike's name to Mike Resource.
I'm sure the Tea Party people are going to have to
Okay. Any other questions on the master plan? Okay, we will delay the approval of it until the January meeting, and we'll have some more discussion in our workshop. Thank you. Good job. Appreciate it. Okay, last item on our agenda is questions about other items that are on the agenda tomorrow. Now's your time to get any questions that you have about any other items that we've got on the agenda. We do have, I think we've, in your folder, we've passed out some new pages. It's just several, basically it was a textbook thing, and we've made a few tweaks on the license action thing. It didn't substantially change anything there, just clarified a little bit. But, I think those are the only two items. Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, the transitional licensure policy, I just wanted to make sure that I was straight on that this is the same policy that we had except for the whole section G, is that right?
That's correct.
Or G under section 2.
New paragraph added,
and that
or
was
new section added in response to the statute.
And that was because of something the legislature did last year, right?
Directed us to correct that, yes. Nothing else in the document changes. That's just parachuted in.
When you look at the structure of that section, the law requires the applicants of higher ed instructors to have 3 years of proficient evaluations. Well, higher ed doesn't evaluate.
No.
So we're going to have to either go back into the legislation or figure out some way what would count as a proficient evaluation. I think it would take a legislative change to really effectuate what they did.
So that's a good example of when you don't really know what to do, you just copy the law in, because there's not really a mechanism for telling a University of Memphis professor that they're proficient or not. They just don't, they're just not built that way, right, as you know. So we worked with the advisory council on this and some other constituency groups, the colleges of teacher ed, and just decided that probably the least painful thing to do is just to use the law as it is, have the language most closely mirror the statute, and then let there be some more discussion about how you actually flesh that out and implement it.
I guess we think there's some value in doing what the intent of that legislation was, but the way it's written practically, it ain't going nothing, if anything.
The only other question I had was, and it may be in this new section we got to add to our packet, item 2C, revised copy of something for that one. It looked to me like the document that I had didn't say what the introduction page said.
It
looked like it might be the old language.
So I believe on where it says proposed proposed rule revision, those two highlighted statutes are the statutes that reference sexual battery by an authority figure and statutory rape.
Oh, okay, so it doesn't have to be in the language.
Correct, it's
Right.
just, if you were to go to that
Those are the
TCA
right- those are
code,
the right numbers.
you would
Okay.
see statutory battery, and the sexual battery by an authority figure.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. Other questions? Okay, very good. Meetings tomorrow, what time? 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock.
Before we adjourn, the only thing I'd like to give the board an update. We have been meeting with the facility and the space management folks who are planning to move. Our building will be remodeled over the next few months, several months. The top floors, I think, are going to be moved out and hoteled in other space. Those floors will be remodeled, and then the bottom floors will move up. And then we'll remodel the bottom floors, and then we'll move back. Our move date is December the 5th. We'll be moving to a space on the backside of Metro Center. I think it's just a nice enough space that will be adequate for us. We'll work out of that until next September. Hopefully by September we'll be able to move back in.
It's a hotel?
No, they call it hoteling. It's an office space.
I wish it was a hotel.
I've never heard it. Well, y'all be down the bar.
Room service.
Certainly a thought.
Okay, I think the discussion, yes, Scott? Scott?
I'll have the van at the hotel at 5:15 for anybody who'd like to be picked up for dinner. I'll be leaving the state building at 5 o'clock for any of the department folks that are riding with me, and then I'll be at the hotel at 5:15.
That's it, great. Very good. Meeting adjourned. Workshop is adjourned.